On a cold April night in 1912, America went to sleep believing the future was unstoppable. Steel was stronger than nature, wealth was safer than fate, and one ship, larger than any ever built, was said to be unsinkable. But before the sun rose, over 1,500 souls were swallowed by the Atlantic, and the United States would wake to a question that still haunts history. How did the most advanced ship on Earth, carrying America's richest dreams and poorest hopes, vanish in a single night? This is not just the story of a ship that sank. This is the night America learned that progress without humility can be deadly.
At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States stood on the edge of a new era, an age defined by ambition, speed, and an unshakable belief in progress. The nation had survived civil war, expanded across a continent, and transformed itself from an agrarian republic into an industrial powerhouse. By 1912, America was no longer merely a young nation finding its place in the world. It was a rising giant, confident that the future belonged to those bold enough to seize it. Factories roared day and night in cities like New York, Pittsburgh, and Chicago. Steel mills forged the skeletons of skyscrapers that clawed toward the sky, while railroads stitched together distant states, shrinking the vastness of the continent. Electricity illuminated streets that once fell into darkness after sunset, and telephones carried voices across unimaginable distances. To many Americans, technology was no longer a tool, it was a promise that human ingenuity could conquer nature itself. This belief in progress shaped the American mindset of the era. Newspapers celebrated invention as heroism. Entrepreneurs were treated like modern kings. Engineers and industrialists were viewed as architects of destiny. In this climate, failure felt impossible, and limits seemed outdated. The world was changing too fast to look back. Yet beneath the surface of optimism, America was deeply divided. The wealth gap was staggering. While industrial tycoons amassed fortunes that rivaled European royalty, millions of working-class Americans struggled to survive in overcrowded tenements. Immigrants arrived by the hundreds of thousands each year, pouring into Ellis Island with dreams of freedom and opportunity, only to face long hours, dangerous jobs, and uncertain futures. For them, America was not a finished dream, it was a gamble. The contrast between wealth and poverty was not hidden, it was accepted as part of progress. In fact, many believed that inequality was proof that the system worked. The American dream, after all, promised opportunity, not equality. If some rose higher than others, it was seen as the natural order of ambition. This philosophy extended beyond the nation's borders. America was becoming a global power. The Spanish-American War had signaled its arrival on the world stage, and American influence now reached across oceans. Trade routes expanded, shipping lines grew more powerful. The Atlantic Ocean, once a terrifying barrier, had become a highway of commerce and migration. Crossing it was no longer an act of survival, it was a statement of modernity. Ocean liners were symbols of this new world. Massive, luxurious, and technologically advanced, they represented national pride and economic strength. To Americans, these ships were floating cities, proof that human ingenuity could tame even the most unforgiving environments. Each new vessel was larger, faster, and more magnificent than the last. Among these giants, none captured the imagination quite like the Titanic. Though built in Belfast, Titanic belonged to an age shaped by American ideals. Its purpose was deeply connected to the United States, to carry wealth, labor, and dreams toward the promise of the new world. For American elites, the ship offered luxury and status. For immigrants, it represented hope. And for the nation itself, it symbolized triumph, proof that modern civilization had mastered the elements. By 1912, the idea of an unsinkable ship did not sound arrogant to most Americans. It sounded logical. After all, hadn't America conquered its frontiers? Hadn't engineers bridged rivers, tunneled through mountains, and bent steel into impossible shapes? The Panama Canal was underway, promising to reshape global trade. If humans could carve a path through continents, why couldn't they build a ship that defied the sea? Confidence was the currency of the age. This confidence extended into daily life. Americans embraced speed, faster trains, faster communication, faster production. Time itself seemed compressed, and patience was viewed as weakness. Progress demanded motion, and hesitation felt like failure. In business, in politics, and in technology, the belief was clear: move forward, no matter the risk. Safety, when it conflicted with speed or profit, often took a back seat. Regulations lagged behind innovation. Oversight was minimal. Many believed that excessive caution stifled growth. This mindset would later prove fatal, not only in factories and railroads, but at sea. The media played a powerful role in reinforcing this worldview. Newspapers competed fiercely for attention, glorifying success and minimizing warning signs. Headlines praised industrial achievement and technological marvels. Disasters, when they occurred, were framed as rare accidents rather than systemic failures. The public was conditioned to trust progress implicitly. Religion and tradition, once central to American life, were increasingly overshadowed by faith in science and engineering. The idea that nature might still command respect felt old-fashioned. The future, Americans believed, was built by men, not governed by fate. Yet history has a way of humbling even the most confident societies. In April 1912, America was at the height of its optimism. The nation looked forward, not backward. It trusted steel more than superstition, innovation more than instinct. And across the Atlantic, a ship carrying this very philosophy sailed toward destiny. On board Titanic were Americans who embodied every layer of society. Magnates who believed wealth could shield them from harm. Immigrants who believed America would save them from poverty. And crew members trained to trust procedures that assumed perfection. Each carried the values of the age with them: faith in systems, faith in progress, faith in inevitability. They did not believe the ocean could challenge them. This was not ignorance, it was cultural conditioning. For decades, Americans had been taught that the future was something to be conquered, not feared. Titanic fit perfectly into this narrative. It was not merely a ship, it was a statement, a declaration that humanity had reached a new level of mastery. When Titanic set sail, America saw no danger, only celebration. No one imagined that this shining symbol of progress would soon expose the fragile illusion beneath modern confidence. No one expected that a single night could undo decades of belief. And no one foresaw that the Atlantic Ocean, silent and indifferent, would remind a powerful nation of an ancient truth. Technology may advance, wealth may rise, and nations may grow, but nature does not negotiate. The sinking of Titanic would not only claim lives, it would shatter assumptions. It would force America to confront the limits of progress and the cost of arrogance. It would mark the end of an era defined by blind optimism and begin a reckoning that reshaped laws, attitudes, and values. But on the eve of that tragedy, America stood proud and unafraid, confident that the future was unsinkable.
At the beginning of the 20th century, the world was intoxicated with possibility. Nowhere was this more evident than in the great shipyards of Europe and America, where steel, steam, and ambition fused into marvels that seemed to defy the limits of nature. Ships were no longer merely vessels for travel. They were symbols of national pride, industrial supremacy, and human triumph.
And among all these symbols, one dream stood above the rest, the dream of an unsinkable ship. This dream did not emerge overnight. It was born slowly, shaped by decades of technological progress and a growing belief that engineering could solve any problem. By 1912, ocean travel had already undergone a revolution. Wooden hulls had given way to steel, sails had been replaced by powerful steam engines, navigation had improved, and disasters at sea, though still possible, were increasingly viewed as relics of a less advanced age. To many Americans, the Atlantic Ocean no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a challenge that had already been conquered. Shipping companies competed fiercely for dominance on the transatlantic route, a lifeline between the old world and the new. Speed mattered, but so did luxury. Wealthy passengers demanded comfort rivaling the finest hotels, while immigrants sought ships that promised safety and reliability. Every new liner was advertised as bigger, faster, and safer than the last. Confidence became a marketing tool. In this environment, the White Star Line envisioned something unprecedented. Rather than building the fastest ships, they chose to build the grandest. Their goal was not merely to cross the Atlantic, but to redefine what ocean travel meant. The result was a trio of liners, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic, each designed to embody stability, elegance, and technological superiority. Titanic, the second of the three, was to be the crown jewel. From the moment its construction began in Belfast, the ship was described in language that bordered on myth. It was massive beyond comprehension, longer than city blocks, taller than most buildings, and heavier than any ship that had ever sailed. Its steel hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments, each sealed by automatic doors designed to close at the first sign of danger. This feature, more than any other, fueled the legend. Popular reports claimed Titanic could remain afloat even if multiple compartments were breached. The idea captured the public imagination. To an age already convinced of progress, the concept of an unsinkable ship felt not like arrogance, but inevitability. Newspapers repeated the claim enthusiastically, often without technical nuance. Advertisements echoed it. Conversations embraced it. The word unsinkable became shorthand for modern perfection. It is important to understand that this belief was not limited to engineers or shipbuilders. It permeated society. Passengers boarded Titanic with complete confidence. Crew members trusted the ship implicitly. Even many professionals believed that a disaster on such a vessel was nearly impossible. This confidence reflected a broader cultural shift, especially in America. The United States had spent decades pushing boundaries, westward expansion, industrial growth, scientific discovery. Each success reinforced the belief that limits existed only to be overcome. The Titanic fit neatly into this narrative. It was proof that humans could impose order on chaos, that technology could tame even the most unpredictable forces. The ocean, once feared, was now seen as manageable. Yet the dream of unsinkability was not purely technical, it was psychological. Titanic offered reassurance in an uncertain world. At a time when millions were uprooting their lives to cross the Atlantic, the promise of safety was powerful. Immigrants clung to it. Wealthy passengers expected it. The ship became a floating guarantee that progress would protect those who trusted it. Ironically, this belief may have been Titanic's greatest vulnerability. Safety, though advanced for the standards of the time, was compromised by overconfidence. Lifeboats, for example, were designed not for every passenger, but compliance with outdated regulations. The assumption was simple: an unsinkable ship would never need them all at once. This logic was rarely questioned. Engineers focused on strength, not redundancy. Designers prioritized aesthetics and comfort alongside safety, believing there was little need to plan for catastrophic failure. The very idea of total disaster seemed absurd in an age defined by success. Even the crew was conditioned to trust the ship more than their instincts.
Training emphasized procedure, but procedure itself was built on assumptions. Assumptions that the ship would remain afloat long enough for help to arrive, that emergencies would be manageable, that chaos would never fully take hold. These beliefs shaped decisions both before and after Titanic struck the iceberg. The dream of unsinkability created a false sense of control. This dream was reinforced by media and public discourse. Newspapers praised Titanic as a marvel of human achievement. Headlines celebrated its size and luxury. Rarely did they dwell on risk. Caution did not sell papers. Confidence did. For Americans reading these stories, Titanic represented the future they believed in, a future of safety, comfort, and mastery over nature. But nature does not read newspapers. On the night Titanic set sail, the dream felt complete. Passengers walked through corridors lined with polished wood and glowing electric lights. The ship's engines hummed with restrained power. The sea, calm and dark, offered no hint of danger. Everything appeared under control. Yet beneath the surface, the dream was fragile. The watertight compartments, while revolutionary, did not extend high enough to prevent water from spilling over once breached. The steel hull, strong but brittle in cold temperatures, was vulnerable in ways not fully understood. Communication systems were advanced, but protocols were unclear. Every safeguard depended on the assumption that no worst-case scenario would occur. And worst-case scenarios are exactly what history delivers. The belief in an unsinkable ship was not just a technical miscalculation, it was a cultural one. It reflected humanity's tendency to confuse innovation with invincibility. Titanic was not merely a product of engineering, it was a product of an era that believed progress could replace humility. When the iceberg struck, the dream did not collapse instantly. At first, there was confusion, denial, even calm. Many passengers refused to believe the ship was in danger. Some delayed evacuation. Others laughed at the suggestion of fear. After all, they were on the Titanic. This ship cannot sink. Those words, spoken in various forms, echoed across the decks, not as arrogance, but as reassurance. People trusted the dream more than the evidence before them, and that trust would cost lives. The tragedy of Titanic lies not only in what happened, but in why it happened. The ship was not doomed by a single mistake, but by a mindset, a collective belief that technology had eliminated the need for caution. The dream of unsinkability blinded people to warning signs, delayed action, and fostered complacency. In the aftermath, the dream shattered. Investigations revealed uncomfortable truths. The ship could sink. The safety measures were insufficient. Confidence had replaced preparedness. The world, and especially America, was forced to confront the reality that progress without respect for limits is dangerous. Titanic became a lesson written in steel and ice. Yet even today, the dream endures in different forms. We continue to build faster, bigger, more complex systems, often believing they are fail-proof. Titanic reminds us that no creation is beyond failure, and no technology is immune to error. The dream of an unsinkable ship was not just about a vessel, it was about humanity's relationship with power. In 1912, that dream sailed proudly into the Atlantic, carrying the hopes of a confident age. By morning, it would lie shattered beneath the waves, leaving behind a legacy that still warns us. No matter how advanced we become, nature remains undefeated, and humility is the most essential design of all.
When Titanic set sail in April 1912, it did not merely carry passengers across the Atlantic, It carried the social structure of an entire age. Floating within its steel walls was a living portrait of early 20th century America, staggering wealth alongside desperate hope, power beside powerlessness, privilege separated from poverty by little more than locked doors and unspoken rules. Titanic was not just a ship, it was America in miniature. At the top of this floating hierarchy were the richest Americans of their time, men and women whose names shaped industries, influenced politics, and defined what success looked like in the modern age. For them, Titanic was not a risk, it was an extension of their world, a palace at sea designed to reflect their status, comfort, and sense of entitlement. Among these passengers were some of the most powerful figures in American society. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest men in the world, boarded Titanic with his young wife, Madeline. Astor represented old American money, fortunes built on real estate, inherited power, and generations of influence. His presence alone symbolized how safe and reliable the ship was believed to be. Men like Astor did not gamble with their lives. If Titanic was good enough for him, it was good enough for anyone. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a vast mining fortune, brought with him the confidence of a man who had never known limits. The Guggenheim name was synonymous with wealth and culture, and Benjamin embodied the era's belief that money could smooth any obstacle, even fate itself. Isidore Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store, was another towering figure of American commerce aboard Titanic. Alongside his wife, Ida, Straus represented not only wealth, but respectability and tradition. Their story would later become one of the most enduring symbols of dignity and love amid catastrophe. These individuals lived in a world shaped by power. Their decisions affected thousands, sometimes millions of lives. They were accustomed to control, over business, over society, over their own destinies. Titanic, with its luxury suites, private promenades, and attentive servants, reinforced that sense of control. For first-class passengers, the ship was a triumph of comfort. They dined on multi-course meals served on fine china. They walked through corridors lined with ornate woodwork and plush carpets. They enjoyed electric lighting, heated swimming pools, Turkish baths, and elegant lounges designed to rival the best hotels in New York or Paris. Everything about their experience whispered the same message: you are safe, you are important, you are protected. The ship's design ensured that they rarely saw those below them. Second-class passengers, many of them professionals, academics, and middle-class Americans, occupied a different but still respectable world. Teachers, engineers, clerks, and small business owners filled these cabins. They represented the rising American middle class, a group that believed deeply in self-improvement and upward mobility. For them, Titanic was aspirational. They were close enough to luxury to taste it, yet far enough from power to admire it. Their accommodations were modest but comfortable, and their journey symbolized progress, proof that they were moving forward in life, quite literally toward a better future. Then there were the third-class passengers. These men, women, and children made up the majority of Titanic's human cargo, and among them were thousands bound for America. Immigrants from Ireland, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and beyond filled the lower decks. They carried everything they owned in suitcases and sacks, their hopes packed tighter than their sleeping quarters. For them, Titanic was not a luxury, it was a lifeline. America represented escape from poverty, persecution, famine, and hopelessness. The ship was a bridge between suffering and opportunity. They endured cramped conditions, unfamiliar languages, and long days at sea because the promise waiting on the other side was worth any discomfort.
They trusted the ship not because it was luxurious, but because they were told it was safe. The class divisions aboard Titanic were rigid, enforced both socially and physically. Doors separated passengers, staircases dictated movement.
Even on a ship sailing through open water, freedom was limited by status. This separation mirrored American society itself. In 1912, wealth dictated opportunity. Power determined survival. The American dream promised mobility, but reality imposed boundaries. Titanic reflected these truths with brutal clarity. When disaster struck, these divisions became deadly. As the ship struck the iceberg and began taking on water, information moved unevenly, much like privilege. First-class passengers were informed earlier, reassured calmly, and guided toward lifeboats. Many third-class passengers were confused, delayed, or unaware of the seriousness of the situation until it was too late. Some were physically prevented from reaching upper decks. Others could not understand instructions given in English. Time, already scarce, slipped away unevenly, flowing freely for some, vanishing for others. Wealth did not guarantee survival, but it offered advantage. Men like Astor and Guggenheim ultimately perished, not because they lacked access, but because of choices shaped by the era's codes of honor. Women and children first was more than a rule. It was a social expectation deeply rooted in class and gender norms. Many wealthy men accepted death with composure, believing it was their duty. Yet even this ideal was shaped by privilege. The very opportunity to choose dignity over survival was a luxury denied to many below deck. For immigrants, chaos was compounded by fear. They had survived so much already: poverty, displacement, long journeys, only to face death at the threshold of their dreams. Their stories rarely made headlines, yet their loss was profound. The tragedy exposed the illusion of equality aboard the unsinkable ship. Titanic did not discriminate in sinking, but survival was deeply influenced by class. Lifeboats left half empty, while hundreds remained trapped below. Wealth bought proximity to safety, information, and time, three resources more valuable than money that night. When news reached America, the shock was immediate and personal. The nation mourned its elites, industrialists, philanthropists, social leaders, whose deaths symbolized vulnerability at the highest levels of society. Newspapers printed their names in bold type, recounting their final moments in dramatic detail. But beneath those headlines were thousands of quieter tragedies. Families waiting at Ellis Island never reunited. Letters went unanswered. Dreams dissolved silently. These losses shaped America too, though they were less visible. Titanic forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about power and privilege. The ship that promised safety revealed inequality. The vessel that symbolized progress exposed complacency. And the passengers who embodied success showed that wealth could not ultimately command nature. Yet the stories of courage endured. Isidore and Ida Strauss refusing separation. Benjamin Guggenheim dressing in formal wear, declaring readiness to go down like a gentleman. Immigrants helping one another despite fear. Crew members sacrificing themselves for strangers. These moments transcended class, reminding the world of shared humanity. In the end, Titanic carried more than passengers. It carried a lesson about the limits of wealth, the fragility of power, and the cost of believing that status can shield us from consequence. America listened. Reforms followed. Safety laws changed. But the deeper lesson lingered longer, echoing across generations. Titanic was a mirror held up to society. It showed America not only who she was, but who she could become if she chose humility over arrogance, compassion over division, and preparedness over pride. The ship sank, but its story rose, etched forever into American memory as a warning written in ice and steel.
On the morning of April 10, 1912, the port of Southampton stirred with a sense of ceremony.
The air carried the smell of salt and coal smoke mixed with anticipation. Dock workers shouted instructions, passengers clutched tickets and luggage, and reporters scanned the crowd for familiar names. Towering above it all stood the RMS Titanic, silent, immovable, and magnificent, waiting to begin a journey that would carry it into history. For those bound for the United States, this was more than a departure, it was a threshold. America, in the early 20th century, existed as both a place and an idea. To some, it was a land of wealth, influence, and opportunity without limits. To others, it was refuge, an escape from hunger, persecution, or a future already decided by birth. Titanic's voyage symbolized movement toward that idea, a physical passage toward reinvention. As the ship prepared to sail, thousands watched from the docks. Some waved with pride, others with fear. Families were divided by distance and uncertainty. For many, this goodbye carried finality, an unspoken understanding that life would never be the same again. Titanic's first-class passengers boarded with confidence. They arrived in tailored coats and polished shoes, assisted by porters who handled their trunks with practiced ease. To them, the voyage was not an act of desperation, but of continuity. Business awaited them in New York. Social seasons would continue. Investments would grow. The ship was simply a refined means of transportation, an elegant bridge between two familiar worlds. For second-class passengers, the moment carried quiet ambition. Teachers, engineers, clergy, and professionals stepped aboard with hope, tempered by realism. America represented advancement, stability, and the possibility of rising further than their parents had. Titanic's voyage was proof that they were moving forward toward opportunity earned through effort rather than inheritance. But for third-class passengers, the act of boarding was deeply emotional. Immigrants clutched documents, photographs, and keepsakes, often the only remnants of the lives they were leaving behind. Many had never seen the ocean before. Some had never traveled beyond their villages. The ship's sheer size overwhelmed them, yet reassured them. If something so enormous existed, perhaps the promises of America were real too. The voyage itself was layered with meaning. Titanic's itinerary mirrored the migration patterns of the era. From Southampton to Cherbourg, then Queenstown, and finally across the Atlantic to New York, each stop adding more passengers, more stories, more dreams. When the ship departed Queenstown on April 11th, it carried not only cargo and mail, but the collective hopes of those who believed the future waited westward. As land disappeared beyond the horizon, the emotional weight of the journey set in. Some passengers felt relief, others felt anxiety. Letters were written, prayers were whispered. For immigrants, the Atlantic represented both separation and possibility, a vast, uncertain space between suffering and hope. Life aboard Titanic quickly settled into rhythm. First-class passengers strolled along the promenade decks, attended social gatherings, and discussed politics, business, and culture. The conversations reflected American confidence. There was talk of expanding industries, growing markets, and a future shaped by innovation. Titanic itself often became the topic, a marvel admired not just for its luxury, but for what it symbolized. Second-class passengers formed friendships, shared meals, and exchanged stories of their plans in America. Many dreamed aloud of careers, education, and stability. Their optimism was grounded but genuine. Below deck, third-class passengers created communities of their own. Music drifted through shared spaces, languages blended, children played in narrow corridors. Despite the cramped conditions, there was laughter. The hardships they had already endured made the voyage feel manageable. Every mile westward brought them closer to a life they believed would be better than the one they had left behind. The ship, in motion, felt invincible. The Atlantic was calm, the weather cooperative. Days passed without incident. For many passengers, especially Americans returning home, the voyage felt routine. There was no sense of danger, only anticipation. This absence of fear was telling. Titanic's reputation preceded it. The idea of unsinkability was not debated, it was accepted. Passengers trusted the ship the way they trusted the modern world, implicitly. The ocean, once feared, had become the backdrop to progress. Yet the journey toward a new world was not just geographical, it was symbolic. America itself was undergoing transformation. Cities were growing, immigration was reshaping society, technology was accelerating life. Titanic carried representatives of this transformation, those who benefited from it, those who sustained it, and those who hoped to join it. On board, these worlds existed side by side, but rarely touched. Class divisions remained rigid. Access was restricted. Experiences differed. Even hope took different forms depending on one's place on the ship. For the wealthy, the future meant expansion. For the middle class, stability. For immigrants, survival and possibility. And yet all were moving in the same direction. As Titanic cut through the Atlantic, it carried the illusion that the future was orderly, predictable, and safe. The ship's steady progress reinforced the belief that modern life could be engineered to eliminate chaos. This belief was shared across classes, cultures, and continents. Passengers slept peacefully at night, lulled by the hum of engines and the gentle rhythm of the sea. They planned reunions, business meetings, and new beginnings. No one imagined that the journey itself was the most significant moment of their lives. The symbolism of arrival loomed large. New York represented culmination. For Americans, it was home. For immigrants, it was arrival. The Statue of Liberty stood not just as a landmark, but as a promise. Titanic was expected to deliver its passengers into that promise without interruption. History, however, rarely honors expectations. The journey toward a new world is often romanticized, but it is also fragile. It depends on systems, assumptions, and human decisions, all vulnerable to error. Titanic embodied this fragility, though no one aboard could yet see it. In retrospect, the calm of those early days feels haunting. The ship moved forward with certainty, unaware that it was also moving toward reckoning. The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, offered no warning. Progress continued uninterrupted. Confidence deepened. The voyage had become a metaphor for the age itself, forward-moving, ambitious, and blind to its own limits. For America, Titanic's voyage represented a continuation of destiny. A nation built on movement, westward expansion, industrial growth, global influence, saw itself reflected in a ship crossing the ocean with ease. But destiny, as history often teaches, is not guaranteed. As Titanic sailed west, carrying dreams toward the new world, it carried the values of its time: faith in technology, trust in systems, and belief in control. These values would soon be tested in ways no one expected. The act of setting sail was not just a beginning, it was a commitment to the idea that the future could be reached simply by moving forward. That belief sustained passengers as they laughed, planned, and slept beneath starlit skies. They did not know that the journey toward a new world would instead become a journey into legend. And so Titanic sailed on, majestic, confident, and unaware, toward a night that would forever redefine what it meant to cross the Atlantic, what it meant to trust progress, and what it meant to chase a dream called America.
Titanic was more than a ship. To its passengers, it was a world unto itself, a floating palace that defied imagination. From the moment travelers stepped aboard, the ship demanded attention, respect, and awe. Its steel hull towered above the docks, but it was the interior, lavish, expansive, meticulously crafted, that truly set it apart. Every detail whispered opulence. Every corridor reflected ambition. For Americans, stepping onto Titanic was like entering a miniature universe, one where wealth, status, and the promise of modernity were tangible. The first-class sections were extraordinary. Here, passengers experienced life as if transported to a luxury hotel on land. Grand staircases soared through multiple decks, adorned with polished oak, brass railings, and crystal chandeliers. The air carried subtle scents, fresh flowers in lounges, the faint aroma of fine cigars, the delicate perfume of wealthy ladies. Carpets muffled footsteps, creating a quiet elegance, punctuated only by the occasional laugh or clink of fine china. Dining on Titanic was an event in itself. First-class passengers dined in the Grand Saloon, a hall so immense that it could seat over 500 guests at a time. Chandeliers reflected light across intricately carved paneling, highlighting scenes of classical art and ornamental flourishes. Waiters, trained in the most exacting traditions, glided through the tables with silent efficiency. Multi-course meals featured fresh seafood, imported meats, and delicate pastries. Men in tailored suits discussed business ventures, politics, or the latest news from New York and Boston. Women, adorned in fine gowns, shared gossip and social updates that would later ripple through their circles back home. For many American elites, Titanic offered not just comfort, but an affirmation of status. Being aboard the world's largest and most luxurious ship meant visibility, influence, and subtly, control. The ship became a theater in which the wealthy acted out their social roles, surrounded by servants, fellow travelers, and the meticulous architecture of opulence. Yet life was not limited to indulgence. Social activities structured the day. Morning promenades on the upper decks allowed passengers to enjoy the sea air and socialize. Afternoon tea gatherings in smaller lounges provided a more intimate setting for conversation and networking. Evening entertainment, live orchestras, dances, and card games kept spirits high, even as the Atlantic stretched endlessly beyond the ship's rails. Second-class passengers also experienced comfort, albeit on a more modest scale. Their cabins were smaller but thoughtfully arranged, offering privacy and functionality. Dining halls were elegant, though less grand, and provided meals that balanced quality and simplicity. For middle-class Americans, these surroundings represented a tangible taste of success and the possibility of upward mobility. The journey itself became a rehearsal for the life they hoped to lead on the other side of the ocean. Meanwhile, third-class passengers faced a very different world. Crowded corridors, shared sleeping quarters, and the hum of activity characterized their experience. Yet, despite these constraints, life aboard Titanic for immigrants was far safer and more comfortable than the conditions many had left behind. Families gathered in common spaces, children played, and a sense of community emerged among strangers united by a shared journey. Food, though basic, was consistent and nourishing. Songs, stories, and laughter echoed through the lower decks, offering hope amid uncertainty. The ship's architecture physically separated passengers according to class, reinforcing social divisions even as it carried all toward the same destination. Stairs, gates, and corridors dictated movement. First-class travelers rarely encountered those below, while third-class passengers glimpsed luxury only from afar. This separation mirrored societal structures of early 20th century America, where opportunity and privilege were dictated by birth, wealth, or circumstance. Crew members were the unseen gears of this floating world. Officers, stewards, and engineers ensured that every system operated smoothly. From maintaining engine pressure to cleaning cabins, the crew's labor was largely invisible, yet essential. American passengers, accustomed to service and comfort, often overlooked the intensity of this work, assuming that the ship's perfection was inevitable rather than maintained by human effort. Behind every polished railing, every glowing light, every hot meal, someone worked tirelessly to sustain the illusion of effortless luxury.
Even in its routine, Titanic inspired wonder. Innovations in engineering were visible in daily life. Electric lighting banished darkness. Hydraulic elevators allowed easy movement between decks. A sophisticated plumbing system delivered hot water on demand. Wireless telegraphy enabled communication across vast distances. Passengers marveled at the technology, often unaware of the intricacies that made such comfort possible. For Americans confident in progress, the ship was proof that human ingenuity had overcome the perils of nature itself. Yet the calm routines also masked vulnerability. Safety features existed, but were taken for granted. Lifeboats lined the decks, but regulations required only a fraction of the number necessary for full capacity. Many passengers assumed these measures would never be needed, confident in the ship's unsinkable reputation. This faith created a subtle collective complacency, a reliance on machinery and engineering that left little room for doubt or preparedness. Interactions aboard Titanic were shaped by manners, expectation, and hierarchy.
First-class passengers moved with a sense of entitlement, often interacting with crew in a formal, transactional manner. They could summon assistance, request services, and expect immediate compliance. Second-class travelers, more restrained, navigated their surroundings with deference and adaptability. Third-class passengers, meanwhile, relied on cooperation within their own communities, assisting one another in ways the wealthier travelers rarely witnessed. Despite the stratification, shared experiences did emerge. The thrill of departure, the rhythm of the sea, and the collective anticipation of arrival in America created a tenuous sense of unity. Festivals, dances, and music brought together those from different backgrounds in moments of fleeting harmony. These glimpses of connection hinted at the underlying humanity aboard the floating palace, even as the social hierarchy remained firmly in place. Daily life also involved small rituals that provided comfort. Morning exercises on deck, afternoon walks, and evening conversations all reinforced a sense of order amid the vastness of the ocean. For many passengers, these rituals were essential, offering reassurance that life continued normally despite the unfamiliar surroundings. Children adapted quickly, playing games and exploring the ship under watchful eyes, embodying the hope that new beginnings awaited in America. For American passengers, Titanic represented more than transportation. It symbolized identity. The ship's grandeur reflected the nation's confidence, ambition, and technological prowess. Being aboard was a statement of success, of modernity, of belonging to a society capable of mastering both nature and social order. Titanic was both a personal and national achievement, a floating monument to human aspiration. Even as passengers settled into routines, Titanic offered moments of awe. Sunsets painted the sky in colors unseen on land. Stars reflected on the calm sea, reminding travelers of the vastness beyond their temporary kingdom. The ocean, though controlled in proximity, remained a silent reminder of forces beyond human mastery. Passengers marveled, wrote letters, and contemplated their futures, often unaware that the serenity around them was as fragile as the steel that enclosed them. The floating palace also demanded discipline. Crew enforced rules, ensured cleanliness, and maintained schedules. Social etiquette governed dining, promenading, and interactions across classes. Passengers adhered to these norms willingly, reinforcing a sense of civilization and structure at sea. For Americans, accustomed to order and organization, this predictability offered comfort and reassurance. Yet, beneath the grandeur, subtle signs of tension existed. Crew members managed hidden anxieties. Mechanical systems, ice warnings, and weather forecasts were monitored quietly away from passengers. Engineers worked tirelessly in the bowels of the ship, maintaining steam pressure and monitoring the engines. These unseen efforts created a fragile equilibrium, sustaining the illusion of safety and perfection. Even in its opulence, Titanic reminded passengers of the human element inherent in all systems. Luxury depended not only on steel and engineering, but on labor, coordination, and constant vigilance. Each meal served, each corridor polished, each deck patrolled was a testament to the effort of hundreds who labored in relative invisibility. Americans aboard, accustomed to comfort, often overlooked these contributions, taking for granted the seamless functioning of the floating palace. Life aboard Titanic, in essence, reflected the broader American experience. It was a microcosm of society, with wealth, class, and opportunity distributed unevenly. It offered glimpses of unity, yet enforced divisions. It showcased human achievement, yet relied on human labor. It promised safety, yet contained vulnerabilities. And it inspired dreams, even as it carried the seeds of tragedy. For those traveling to America, Titanic was both literal and symbolic, a bridge to a new life, a vessel of dreams, and a statement of possibility. The ship's beauty, scale, and sophistication were awe-inspiring, but they also concealed the risks inherent in human ambition. Passengers reveled in comfort and security, confident that the world had been tamed, unaware that the ocean beneath them was indifferent to wealth, class, or status. In this floating palace, Americans experienced the convergence of technology, luxury, and hope. They strolled, dined, conversed, and dreamed, all while the vast Atlantic carried them steadily toward the promise of New York. The rhythms of the voyage, the elegance of surroundings, and the intricate social dynamics combined to create a world suspended in time, a world where human aspiration seemed to conquer both distance and danger. Yet, as history would soon demonstrate, even the grandest palace could not withstand the forces of nature. Titanic's luxury, order, and social structure, impressive as they were, could not prevent disaster. The floating palace, for all its splendor, remained vulnerable. Every gilded railing, every ornate staircase, every well-tended cabin depended on the unseen labor and untested assumptions that would be tested with unforgiving severity. And so life aboard the floating palace continued, majestic, routine, and vibrant, carrying dreams, ambitions, and fears across the Atlantic, unaware that the journey would soon demand courage, sacrifice, and humanity in ways no passenger could have anticipated.
The Atlantic in April 1912 was a study in deceptive calm. The sea stretched endlessly, its surface smooth under the early spring sun, hiding the icy darkness that lay beneath. The air carried neither storm nor turbulence, and yet, for those trained to read the ocean, subtle signals hinted at danger. Titanic sailed through this expanse with confidence, its engines humming, its decks alive with life, its passengers blissfully unaware that the most critical warnings of their voyage were already being overlooked. In the early 20th century, confidence was a cultural currency. America, along with much of the Western world, had embraced a belief in progress that bordered on hubris. Steel could be stronger than mountains, machines faster than horses, and human ingenuity more reliable than nature. The same mindset that celebrated skyscrapers in New York and industrial feats in Chicago also influenced perceptions of ocean travel. Ships like Titanic were not merely vessels, they were proof of human mastery. To challenge that belief with caution, doubt, or fear was almost heretical. Yet the warnings were there. From the moment Titanic left Southampton, messages flowed in from other ships. Wireless operators on vessels ahead reported vast ice fields, drifting icebergs, and growing danger along the North Atlantic shipping lanes. Some messages were urgent, others routine. Many arrived in fragmented form, often couched in technical language that the ship's officers interpreted through the lens of confidence rather than caution. Captain Edward Smith, a veteran with decades of experience at sea, received these ice warnings. In his mind, Titanic was capable of handling nearly anything.
The ship's construction, its watertight compartments, its size, and its speed all seemed to him sufficient safeguards. In the culture of the era, the combination of experience, technology, and human skill was assumed to be more than enough. Warnings, while acknowledged, were treated as manageable inconveniences, not immediate threats. Wireless operators transmitted and received messages throughout the day. Some messages reported icebergs well south of usual shipping lanes. Others indicated large ice fields ahead. Operators, often young and eager to impress, assumed that reporting these messages promptly to the bridge was sufficient, yet the urgency of these warnings was filtered through multiple layers of confidence, hierarchy, and assumptions about safety. The very systems designed to protect passengers became instruments of complacency. Even crew members recognized the peril but were constrained by culture and procedure. Officers relied on lookouts, binoculars, and experience, yet were also influenced by the public belief in Titanic's invincibility. To question the safety of the world's largest ship in front of passengers or peers would have seemed unnecessary and even absurd. Confidence suppressed caution, and tradition enforced it. Meanwhile, American passengers, deeply invested in the myth of Titanic's perfection, played their own part. They read newspapers, listened to conversations, and observed the ship's crew, drawing reassurance from what they saw. The most celebrated figures, John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and others, walked the decks without hesitation, modeling composure and trust. Their faith in the ship reinforced the collective denial, spreading across first-class lounges, promenades, and dining halls. When the wealthiest Americans ignored the ice warnings in spirit, few dared to acknowledge their gravity. At night, the dangers of the Atlantic were even more insidious. Icebergs, despite their massive size, could appear suddenly under moonlight or in the dim haze of evening. The freezing temperature caused steel to become brittle, a factor not widely understood even among engineers. Waves reflected little light, and lookouts relied on eyesight alone, unassisted by radar or modern navigation. The combination of environmental risk and technological limitations made vigilance critical. Yet confidence, both human and cultural, blinded many to the necessity of heightened caution. Ice warnings were often marked "received" but not acted upon in ways that might have reduced risk. Ships ahead reported areas thick with ice, yet Titanic maintained near maximum speed, a decision influenced by pride, schedule, and the desire to impress passengers. Time, after all, was a luxury Americans and Europeans both valued highly, and the public imagined progress as something continuous, uninterrupted, and unthreatened. Reducing speed in the face of potential danger seemed almost unnecessary to a culture enamored with mastery. The bridge itself became a theater of judgment and assumption. Officers debated minor course adjustments, often weighing speed against safety, influenced by Captain Smith's confidence. Reports of icebergs were cross-referenced with maps and predictions, and conclusions were drawn with optimism rather than caution. Each decision was filtered through a lens that assumed control, skill, and invulnerability. Human error, miscommunication, and the weight of expectation converged, creating a perfect environment for disaster. Wireless communication, a new technology at the time, was another factor in the mismanagement of warnings. Messages from other ships were sometimes delayed, misunderstood, or deprioritized in the rush to transmit passenger telegrams. The social and technical limitations of wireless, combined with assumptions about Titanic's robustness, allowed critical ice alerts to lose urgency.
The very systems meant to protect passengers inadvertently reinforced the narrative of invincibility. American passengers, for their part, contributed indirectly to this atmosphere of complacency. Luxury, comfort, and spectacle created distraction,
Evening performances, social gatherings, and fine dining occupied attention, drawing eyes and minds away from the peril beyond the decks. Passengers assumed safety because they saw elegance, routine, and decorum. The separation of classes further insulated the wealthy from potential danger below, both physically and psychologically. Even the Titanic's design reinforced a sense of security that was dangerously misleading. Watertight compartments were praised widely, reported in newspapers, and discussed socially as proof of invincibility. Yet the mechanics of flooding, bulkhead height, and hull brittleness were not fully understood by those making operational decisions. Confidence in design supplanted critical examination of vulnerability. The iceberg itself, a silent, massive sentinel of nature, awaited with no awareness of human assumptions. It drifted in cold, dark waters, oblivious to society's pride, wealth, or expectation of control. The collision that would soon occur was not just a result of environmental factors, but cultural, psychological, and systemic ones: overconfidence, miscommunication, and human reliance on mythologized technology. By April 14th, as Titanic sailed deeper into the North Atlantic, the convergence of these factors, ignored warnings, cultural pride, human error, and environmental risk, created a moment pregnant with tragedy. Crew members, passengers, and officers were unknowingly dancing on the edge of disaster, confident that their instruments, judgment, and ship would carry them safely. In the age of confidence, the world believed that mastery was absolute and that innovation could replace vigilance. Yet the ocean, indifferent and immutable, would test this hubris mercilessly. The iceberg collision, when it occurred late that night, was the culmination of ignored signs, assumptions, and human optimism. It revealed the vulnerability beneath grandeur. It exposed the failure of systems, the limitations of foresight, and the fatal consequences of a culture that equated progress with invincibility. The age of confidence, celebrated in newspaper headlines and social discourse, faced a harsh reckoning. American passengers, along with all aboard, experienced shock, disbelief, and panic. Many still refused to acknowledge the full gravity of the situation. Crew members, trained to maintain order, struggled against both human behavior and the limitations of their procedures. Information moved unevenly, just as the warnings had, revealing the fragility of assumption-based confidence. Those who had relied entirely on Titanic's perfection found themselves confronting the undeniable reality that nature, despite human achievement, remained uncontrollable. In the hours following the iceberg strike, the consequences of ignored warnings became devastatingly clear. Lifeboats were insufficient, communication errors multiplied, and the distribution of information reflected social hierarchies. The patterns established before departure, faith in design, belief in status, and collective complacency directly influenced who survived and who did not. The age of confidence collided violently with the immutable laws of physics and nature. Titanic's tragedy served as a global cautionary tale. Newspapers in the United States and around the world detailed the ignored warnings, critiqued decisions, and mourned lost lives. Investigations revealed systemic failures, overconfidence, and underestimation of risk. Yet the cultural lesson remained more profound. Human achievement without humility and respect for reality can never be absolute. Confidence, when untempered by caution, becomes vulnerability. The story of Titanic in the North Atlantic that night is not merely a tale of ice and steel. It is a story of mindset. It is the narrative of a society enthralled by progress, mesmerized by technological marvels, and willing to ignore warning signs because belief in mastery seemed sufficient. In the age of confidence, humanity flirted with hubris, and the ocean, silent and impartial, exacted its price. As dawn approached on April 15th, the scoop of the disaster crystallized. Lives lost, social hierarchies tested, and the limits of human ingenuity painfully revealed. The iceberg had proven what all warnings had implied, that nature does not negotiate with pride, and that confidence, no matter how sophisticated, is no substitute for caution. Titanic's tragedy would echo for generations. Americans, having watched wealth, status, and the illusion of invincibility confront the ultimate test, were forced to confront the limits of their own assumptions. The iceberg was more than an object. It was a symbol, a warning ignored not in malice, but in the very cultural DNA of a society intoxicated with its own progress. It reminded the world that in the vast expanse of life, like the endless Atlantic, overconfidence can be fatal. Titanic's voyage that night remains a testament to the tension between human ambition and natural law, a stark reminder that even the grandest designs, the most brilliant minds, and the deepest pockets cannot guarantee survival when warnings are dismissed and confidence replaces caution.
The night of April 14, 1912, began as any other voyage on the RMS Titanic. The ship, resplendent in its grandeur, glided through the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Passengers slept peacefully in their cabins, promenaded under the moonlight, or gathered in lounges for evening entertainment. The calm sea and clear sky offered no warning that within hours the Atlantic would reveal its merciless power. What began as a serene crossing would soon transform into chaos, terror, and a test of human endurance. In first-class cabins, the affluent and powerful continued their evening routines. Women in flowing gowns retreated to their rooms after dances and card games, while men discussed business, politics, and society in private lounges. Some retired early, lulled by the ship's gentle rhythm. Outside, the upper decks sparkled with electric lights, the sea reflecting the vessel's brilliance like a floating city. To Americans aboard, Titanic represented mastery, a palace at sea, invincible, secure, and orderly. Below deck, in second and third class areas, life mirrored both hope and fatigue. Immigrant families shared stories of their dreams, children slept in shared cabins, and passengers anticipated the promise of New York. Despite their differences in wealth and privilege, all shared the same trajectory, toward the new world and toward destiny. Yet the illusion of control was about to shatter. At 11:40 p.m., the first, almost imperceptible collision occurred. Deep in the night, the Titanic struck an iceberg, a silent, massive force moving through the cold Atlantic. The sound was subtle at first, a scraping, grinding noise that only those nearest to the hull might have noticed. The engines shuddered, but the massive ship continued forward, its immense momentum masking the initial damage. Few passengers felt anything unusual. Even officers, though aware of the collision, were uncertain of its severity. It would take only minutes for the magnitude of the disaster to become clear. Watertight compartments, once hailed as the pinnacle of engineering, were breached. Steel plates buckled under pressure. Water began to fill the forward compartments, creeping inexorably toward the heart of the ship. Titanic, believed to be unsinkable, was facing a scenario engineers had not fully imagined. The silence of the night masked the danger, as the first pangs of panic would soon ripple through the decks. Captain Edward Smith, an experienced mariner, quickly assessed the situation. Orders were given to inspect the hull and confirm the extent of flooding. The wireless operators transmitted urgent messages to nearby ships requesting assistance. Yet the ship's vast size, combined with human underestimation of risk, meant that the threat was only partially understood. Confidence still dominated judgment, even as reality began to assert itself. On the upper decks, some passengers noticed the unusual motion of the ship, a slight but undeniable tilt.
Servants whispered among themselves, officers conferred quietly, and crew prepared for a scenario that, up until now, had seemed impossible. First-class passengers, accustomed to comfort and security, were largely unaware of the full danger. Many continued social activities, trusting in the vessel's perfection and their own judgment. Meanwhile, in the lower decks, the tension grew in a different way. Immigrant passengers in third-class cabins felt vibrations, water seepage, and an unfamiliar chill. Yet language barriers, limited information, and the separation from officers above delayed their understanding of the imminent threat. Doors locked by class divisions, narrow corridors, and lack of guidance compounded confusion. The very systems designed for order now reinforced isolation, leaving many vulnerable. The first lifeboats were readied, though a sense of disbelief permeated the upper decks. Officers and crew faced the challenge of convincing passengers that evacuation was necessary. Some refused to leave their cabins, believing the ship could possibly sink. Others hesitated, trusting in the unsinkable reputation that had been advertised across the globe. This hesitation, emblematic of the era's faith in human achievement, cost critical minutes. American passengers, in particular, exhibited a complex mix of behavior. Some moved decisively, helping family members and boarding lifeboats with calm determination. Others, reassured by status and privilege, delayed action. The Titanic's social hierarchy dictated behavior even in crisis. First-class passengers were given priority and guidance. Second-class passengers followed, while third-class passengers often faced barriers, both literal and cultural, to escape. The chaos expanded rapidly as water filled the lower compartments. The ship began a slow but inexorable tilt forward. Crew members worked tirelessly, guiding passengers, lowering lifeboats, and maintaining order. Yet fear, panic, and disbelief spread in waves. People shouted, children cried, and some men refused to leave, holding on to societal codes of honor and bravery. The night was alive with human emotion, courage, despair, loyalty, selfishness, and panic. In the grand first-class dining saloons and lounges, passengers gathered their belongings, often reluctantly, before moving toward the lifeboats. Jewelry, clothing, and personal items were collected in the hope of preservation, yet the urgency increased with every passing moment. Officers struggled to maintain both composure and order, aware that the world's eyes would soon turn to the unfolding tragedy.
The ship's engineering staff worked in the bowels of Titanic, aware that water pressure was rising and that the flooding would soon exceed the design of watertight compartments. Men in the engine room labored to keep the engines running, not for speed, but to provide power for lighting, communications, and pumps. Their endurance, courage, and technical skill were tested to the utmost, as the very lifeblood of the ship depended on their actions. As the lifeboats were lowered, tensions among passengers escalated. Women and children were prioritized, as per maritime custom, yet the implementation of this policy varied widely. Some boats departed half full due to confusion or disbelief. Officers faced moral and practical dilemmas: obey the code, maintain order, and save as many lives as possible. The night air was filled with shouts, instructions, prayers, and sobs, a cacophony that would echo in survivors' memories forever. American elites such as John Jacob Astor IV displayed composure and courage, assisting others and adhering to social norms even as they confronted mortality. Stories of heroism emerged quickly. Benjamin Guggenheim donning evening attire and preparing to go down like a gentleman. Isidor Straus refusing separation from his wife. These acts of bravery highlighted both the human capacity for dignity and the social codes deeply ingrained in early 20th century America. Meanwhile, third-class passengers confronted a harsher reality. Locked gates, complex corridors, and a lack of guidance delayed evacuation.
Some tried to force their way upward, while others remained unaware of the severity of the situation. Their survival depended on timing, initiative, and sometimes sheer luck. The disparity in experience between social classes became tragically clear, reflecting broader societal inequalities. The night deepened, and Titanic's angle of descent became more pronounced. The forward compartments were flooded beyond control, and the bow sank steadily. Panic intensified. Officers and crew continued to manage lifeboat loading, prioritizing safety and adhering to protocol, even as the ship's enormity threatened to overwhelm both human and mechanical limits. Above, the cold North Atlantic wind cut through clothing, chilling passengers as they awaited their turn. Below, water crept through corridors, sending families fleeing into unfamiliar spaces. The sound of steel groaning, water rushing, and human cries created an auditory landscape of horror. In these moments, the illusion of control shattered, replaced by raw fear and the struggle for survival. The wireless operators transmitted distress signals throughout the night. Nearby ships, including the Carpathia, responded immediately, setting course toward Titanic. Yet the vastness of the Atlantic meant that rescue would take hours. Time, always a measure of confidence, became the ultimate adversary. The ocean's indifference emphasized human vulnerability. Skill, wealth, and technology were no match for natural forces when combined with human error and underestimation. As lifeboats filled and were lowered, difficult choices were made. Some men stayed behind, honoring social norms or believing they could help others. Many passengers experienced split-second decisions that would define their survival. Families were separated, friendships tested, and courage manifested in countless forms. The night transformed from a voyage of comfort into a crucible of human emotion. By 2:20 a.m., Titanic's final moments approached. The bow plunged beneath the waves, the stern rising precariously before collapsing. The ocean claimed both steel and dreams. Those in lifeboats watched helplessly as the floating palace sank, taking with it the illusions of invincibility, the symbols of social hierarchy, and the stories of those who had trusted the myth of unsinkability. Survivors, including many Americans, clung to boats, debris, or each other. Hypothermia, exhaustion, and shock compounded the trauma. The night that had begun with calm and anticipation ended in grief, heroism, and incomprehensible loss. The Atlantic, vast and silent once again, had exacted its toll with impartial precision. In the aftermath, the scale of human experience aboard Titanic became clear. Stories of courage, sacrifice, and tragedy emerged alongside tales of misjudgment and missed opportunity. The night revealed the fragility of human constructs. Wealth, power, technology, and confidence could not overcome nature's force when assumptions replaced vigilance. For America, the sinking of Titanic was both a national shock and a cultural reckoning. The stories of the wealthy and powerful, the middle class and the immigrants alike, highlighted both the heroism and vulnerability of a society confident in its mastery. Lessons learned from that night would shape maritime safety, public perception, and collective memory for generations. The night the ocean turned deadly transformed Titanic from a marvel of engineering into a cautionary tale. It revealed that even the most magnificent achievements could falter in the face of natural law, human error, and the fragile illusion of invincibility. The tragedy became a mirror for society, reflecting both its highest aspirations and its most profound vulnerabilities. Titanic's story endured because of that night. The hours of terror, the acts of bravery, the failures of judgment, and the stark confrontation between human ambition and the indifference of the sea.
Titanic had been celebrated before it ever touched water, heralded as the largest, fastest, and most luxurious vessel in the world. Newspapers across the United States proclaimed it a marvel of modern engineering, a floating palace that would redefine ocean travel. From the steel of its hull to the grandeur of its dining saloons, the ship was framed as invincible, a triumph of human achievement over the forces of nature. Among passengers, the refrain was almost unanimous: "This ship cannot sink." For American travelers, the assertion resonated deeply. The nation itself was in an era of boundless confidence. Industry was booming, cities were growing skyward, and technology promised to conquer every obstacle. Titanic's voyage across the Atlantic was more than a journey. It was a continuation of a worldview, that progress was unstoppable, that human skill could outmatch nature, and that wealth and status guaranteed safety. In this context, the belief in Titanic's invincibility became almost sacred. Among first-class passengers, this faith was unquestioned. Men in tailored suits and women in flowing gowns regarded the ship not merely as transportation, but as a symbol of social hierarchy and personal achievement. They trusted the architects, the engineers, and the captain implicitly. The assertion, "This ship cannot sink," was repeated casually in conversation, a phrase delivered with both pride and amusement. It reassured them, wrapped them in comfort, and reinforced the illusion of absolute control. John Jacob Astor IV, the wealthy industrialist, epitomized this mindset. Traveling with his young wife, Madeline, he had invested confidence not only in the ship's structure, but in the mastery of human knowledge over the ocean itself. To Astor, Titanic represented the culmination of technological progress, a vessel designed to resist nature's fury. Even in jest, his statement echoed in the minds of those around him. If Titanic could fail, then what could be considered safe? The crew shared the confidence of their passengers. Captain Edward Smith, long celebrated for his experience and judgment, had sailed through ice-laden waters many times. Officers relied on the strength of the ship and their knowledge of the Atlantic, interpreting ice warnings with calm assurance. Wireless operators transmitted reports, and engineers checked compartments and engines with meticulous care, confident that no circumstance could overwhelm the ship's design. Every system, from watertight bores to lifeboats, was considered more than adequate, a safety net that bolstered morale. Yet this confidence carried a subtle danger. Faith in invincibility dulled vigilance. Reports of icebergs were acknowledged, but the perception of threat remained abstract, distant, and in many minds improbable. Passengers, officers, and crew alike shared a psychological buffer, a belief that the Titanic, the greatest ship ever built, would protect them without question. Complacency, born of certainty, became the unseen vulnerability. The ship's outward appearance reinforced this mindset. Grand staircases soared through multiple decks, crystal chandeliers glittered in every lounge, and corridors were polished to perfection. The first-class dining saloon, capable of seating over 500 guests, symbolized not only luxury but also stability and order. For Americans, accustomed to the rise of skyscrapers and the expansion of commerce, Titanic seemed a natural extension of progress. Its elegance suggested permanence, and permanence implied safety. Second-class passengers, too, embraced the notion that the ship was invulnerable. For them, Titanic represented opportunity, comfort that was impressive but not extravagant, a bridge to the promise of America. They had invested faith in the ship's designers, in the captain's judgment, and in the very culture of confidence that permeated the voyage. For immigrants in third class, the mantra, "This ship cannot sink," was almost aspirational, a psychological defense against the profound uncertainties of their journey. Even as Titanic traversed the North Atlantic, that belief shaped behavior. Passengers relaxed on promenade decks, children played in cabins, and families shared stories of the future awaiting them in New York.
Evening dances, card games, and conversations flowed uninterrupted. No one anticipated that the world they had come to rely upon, the ship, the crew, the engineering, could fail. The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, remained invisible, its dangers abstract, unreal, and unthreatening to human pride. Yet beneath this veneer of invincibility, warning signs accumulated. Ice reports arrived from ships ahead, transmitted via wireless telegraph. Crew members noted floating ice and smaller bergs in the ship's path. Even officers voiced minor concerns, but confidence overshadowed caution. The ship's speed remained high, a deliberate choice influenced by pride, schedule, and social expectation. The culture of belief in Titanic's perfection dictated that efficiency, style, and optimism were more important than conservative prudence.
As the hours passed on the night of April 14th, the collision became inevitable. In the darkness, the Titanic scraped against a massive iceberg, ripping open the hull along its forward starboard side. The impact was sudden but muted, enough to jolt crew members into action, but insufficient at first to provoke mass alarm. Steel groaned. Water began to enter compartments. The illusions of invincibility, meticulously maintained for days, began to crack. Yet many passengers, shielded by distance and privilege, remained unaware of the severity. At first, disbelief dominated. "This ship cannot sink," passengers repeated, a mantra reinforced by a lifetime of social and cultural conditioning. Crew members attempted to reconcile the collision with their assumptions, inspecting compartments, consulting schematics, and evaluating pumping capacity. Confidence, long a source of comfort, now competed with emerging reality. First-class passengers, in their cabins and lounges, continued to act as if the night were ordinary. Women adjusted gowns, men smoked cigars, and children slept, oblivious to the rising water. Some staff attempted to convey urgency, but the message was diluted by disbelief. The very architecture that separated passengers by class also insulated them from danger, prolonging a fatal illusion. Below decks, the scenario was different. Third-class passengers felt cold, heard unusual sounds, and began to question the ship's safety. Yet confusion, compounded by locked gates, unfamiliar corridors, and language barriers, delayed understanding and action. The mantra, "This ship cannot sink," had less reach here, yet its cultural echo from above deck indirectly influenced behavior. Passengers trusted the systems in place, assuming their safety was engineered. The iceberg's damage exceeded assumptions. Water entered 5 of Titanic's forward compartments, a scenario not anticipated in design calculations. Officers realized the gravity, but still held hope that the ship could remain afloat long enough for evacuation. Lifeboats were prepared, but social hierarchy influenced deployment. First-class women and children were prioritized. Middle-class and immigrant passengers followed, and many remained trapped below. Confidence, once reassuring, now shaped survival in tragic ways. The human response was a mixture of heroism, panic, and denial. John Jacob Astor assisted his wife and others into lifeboats, epitomizing courage tempered by privilege. Benjamin Guggenheim donned evening attire and prepared to face the inevitable with dignity. Crew members worked tirelessly, managing chaos, coordinating evacuation, and attempting to maintain order. Simultaneously, others clung to cabins, balked at leaving personal belongings, or refused to believe the ship could fail. Throughout the night, the mantra, "This ship cannot sink," transformed from reassurance to ironic tragedy. Its repetition underscored the hubris that had defined Titanic's culture. Passengers and crew alike were confronted with the undeniable reality that no steel, no wealth, no human confidence could defy the laws of nature. The Atlantic claimed the ship and lives with impartial efficiency, exposing the fragility underlying pride and assumption. By early morning, Titanic had vanished beneath the waves.
Lifeboats bobbed in the icy water, carrying survivors who were left to grapple with grief, shock, and the haunting awareness of hubris. The ocean, vast and indifferent, had overturned centuries of belief in invincibility. "This ship cannot sink" became an epitaph for misplaced confidence, a symbol of cultural pride confronted by the relentless force of nature. American newspapers reported the disaster with shock and disbelief. The phrase repeated in society and in memory, once an affirmation of technological supremacy, now a haunting reminder of vulnerability. Investigations would later critique assumptions, communication failures, and design limitations. Yet beyond technical lessons, Titanic's sinking exposed a broader truth. Confidence, untempered by caution and humility, can be as fatal as an iceberg. The story of Titanic, embodied in the refrain, "This ship cannot sink," remains a cautionary tale. It illustrates the intersection of human ambition, technological achievement, and the forces of nature. Americans aboard experienced wealth, privilege, and culture, only to confront mortality and limitation. The ship's elegance and might could not protect them from the ocean's reality. Hubris, in the form of belief in invincibility, collided with nature, producing a catastrophe that continues to resonate. In the end, Titanic was not merely a vessel, but a mirror for society. Its passengers, from the richest industrialists to the immigrants seeking a new life, learned in the most tragic way that human constructs, no matter how grand, cannot overcome the impartial laws of the natural world. The mantra that began as pride and reassurance, "This ship cannot sink," became a legacy of warning. Progress and confidence must be balanced with vigilance, humility, and respect for forces beyond control. And so the Titanic sank, taking with it more than lives. It claimed the illusion of invincibility, leaving survivors, historians, and generations of Americans to reflect on the thin line between ambition and arrogance, confidence and disaster, hubris and humility.
The night the Titanic collided with the iceberg, the ship transformed from a palace of comfort into a theater of chaos. Within moments, the structure that had represented invincibility was flooded with uncertainty, fear, and unanticipated peril. Above and below decks, passengers and crew alike confronted a reality that defied their assumptions. Wealth, status, and human ingenuity could not protect them from the indifferent power of the Atlantic. The grandeur of Titanic, once a symbol of human mastery, now stood as a fragile veneer over chaos. First-class passengers were among the first to sense the anomaly. A slight shudder, the scrape of steel against ice, and the unusual tilt of the bow initiated confusion. Officers rushed to inspect damage, yet information was incomplete and conflicting. Many passengers, confident in the ship's design, dismissed the incident initially as minor. The echoing mantra that had defined the voyage, "This ship cannot sink," persisted in whispers, reassurances, and even laughter. Confidence clashed violently with the emerging truth, creating a psychological tension that would define the hours to come. Within the first-class dining saloon and lounges, the initial response varied. Some men instructed staff to begin preparing lifeboats, prioritizing the safety of women and children. Others lingered, reluctant to abandon possessions or trust that evacuation was necessary. American elites, accustomed to control over their surroundings, faced the first real instance in which money and influence could not dictate outcomes. Even for the wealthiest, the illusion of security was dissolving rapidly. Meanwhile, third-class passengers experienced the chaos differently. Isolated by design, they were physically separated from the upper decks, often confined behind locked gates or narrow corridors. Rumors and fragmented information filtered down slowly. Families clutched one another, children cried, and the unfamiliarity of both ship and situation magnified terror. Many had embarked on Titanic with hopes for a new life in America, only to confront the stark inequities that persisted even in moments of crisis. The crew faced a dual challenge, maintaining order among panicked passengers while executing emergency procedures designed to save lives. Officers ran up and down decks, giving instructions, lowering lifeboats, and trying to coordinate the evacuation. Their courage was tested not only by the physical demands of the task, but the emotional strain of witnessing fear and desperation at every level of society. In many cases, decisions had to be made in seconds, balancing protocol with compassion and logic with the unpredictable behavior of terrified humans. American passengers in particular displayed varied responses, shaped by class, expectation, and upbringing. First-class women often relied on the guidance of stewards and officers, trusting in established procedures, even as panic crept into the surrounding environment. Some men assisted family members and fellow passengers, demonstrating selflessness under pressure. Others, caught between denial and fear, hesitated, clinging to the belief that the ship's reputation would ensure safety. The social conditioning of wealth, poise, composure, and control both helped and hindered survival. Second-class passengers navigated a more ambiguous position. Their cabins offered comfort, yet they were not prioritized during evacuation. Many moved independently, relying on observation, intuition, and quick thinking to reach lifeboats. Language barriers among immigrant populations and the lack of clear instructions added layers of difficulty. Yet, within this middle-class group, acts of courage emerged. Men assisted women and children, strangers cooperated under stress, and resourcefulness became a matter of life and death. The class divide became tragically apparent as lifeboats were launched. First-class passengers were prioritized, often with the assistance of officers and crew who ensured that women and children boarded first. Many lifeboats departed partially filled due to confusion, disbelief, and social hesitation. Some passengers still assumed that Titanic could not truly sink. Second-class passengers, despite often understanding the risk, faced delays and limited access. Third-class passengers encountered the greatest obstacles. Locked gates, confusing passageways, and delayed communication compounded the challenge of reaching safety. Within the chaos, human courage shone in unexpected ways. Crew members, including stewards and officers, put themselves at risk repeatedly, guiding passengers to lifeboats and maintaining order under impossible conditions. Stories emerged of first-class men assisting strangers, immigrant families working together to navigate corridors, and women protecting children despite fear and exhaustion. Courage, in its myriad forms, became the counterpoint to chaos, offering a measure of hope amid devastation. Amid this human struggle, the starkness of social hierarchy remained undeniable. The Titanic's design, reflecting early 20th century societal norms, physically reinforced separation. Staircases, gates, and corridors directed movement and access. In a moment where collective survival required cooperation, these artificial divisions influenced who had the opportunity to escape. The disparity in survival rates between classes was not solely a function of luck, but also of structural and systemic limitations. Even as the bow began to submerge, officers continued to prioritize evacuation with remarkable discipline. They faced a profound moral burden to enforce maritime protocol while recognizing the humanity of those trapped below. Some men accepted that they would not survive if it meant ensuring the survival of women and children, a reflection of both societal expectation and personal integrity.
Their courage, often silent and unseen, exemplified the tension between societal norms and the raw reality of disaster. First-hand accounts from American passengers reveal the psychological complexity of that night. Shock, disbelief, and fear coexisted with acts of heroism, pragmatism, and self-sacrifice. Survivors recall moments when time slowed, the creaking of steel, the hiss of water entering compartments, the frantic instructions from crew, and the cries of children and adults alike. These details paint a vivid picture of human resilience amidst overwhelming chaos. Third-class passengers, particularly immigrants, displayed resourcefulness that was often overlooked by contemporary narratives. Families navigated unfamiliar corridors, helped one another through gates, and improvised means of reaching upper decks. Courage in this context was less ceremonial and more practical, understanding, improvising, and taking initiative in the absence of formal guidance. The disparity between this courage and the structural obstacles imposed by class underscored the inequities inherent even in life-and-death situations. In the freezing North Atlantic waters, lifeboats became microcosms of society. Those who had boarded were confronted with both physical peril and emotional trauma. Survivors witnessed acts of bravery, selfishness, and despair in close proximity. Women and children clung to family members. Officers maintained protocols, and passengers tried to console one another amid fear and the eerie quiet of the open ocean. The interplay of human behavior illuminated both the nobility and the fragility of the human spirit. The sinking itself amplified chaos. Titanic's bow plunged, stern rose, and the massive vessel's collapse created waves that threatened even the lifeboats. Passengers and crew scrambled to maintain balance, rescue others, and survive. Acts of courage multiplied. Men jumped into icy waters to save family members, crew members managed overloaded boats, and strangers supported one another in the final moments. Chaos and courage coexisted, their boundaries defined by necessity and human instinct. Throughout the ordeal, the social hierarchy continued to influence survival. Officers and crew prioritized evacuation protocols that reflected societal norms. First-class women and children were saved in greater numbers, second-class passengers fared moderately, and third-class passengers were disproportionately affected by structural and procedural obstacles. These outcomes highlighted the interplay of human decision-making, institutional design, and social expectation in moments of crisis. American passengers observed, adapted, and sometimes resisted these divisions. Some helped bridge class gaps, guiding strangers through corridors, sharing space in lifeboats, and offering comfort to those previously isolated. Others remained constrained by social norms, prioritizing family and class-defined responsibilities. The night's events illustrated the profound complexity of human behavior when survival, ethics, and societal expectation collided. As dawn approached, the scope of tragedy became undeniable. Titanic had transformed from a palace of confidence into a scene of loss, heroism, and irreversible consequence. Survivors, scattered across lifeboats, reflected on the chaotic hours that had tested courage, revealed inequities, and illuminated both the best and worst aspects of human nature. In the chaos, patterns emerged. Courage was not defined by wealth or status, but by action in the moment, while the class divide, physical, social, and cultural, continued to shape opportunity and fate. The stories that emerged from that night would endure. Accounts of heroism, self-sacrifice, improvisation, and bravery highlighted the human capacity for dignity even amidst disaster. Accounts of missed opportunities, delayed evacuations, and the disproportionate suffering of certain groups revealed the persistent influence of social hierarchy. Chaos, courage, and class divide were inextricably linked, forming the narrative that would define Titanic's legacy. For American society, the lessons were profound. The night revealed the limits of wealth, the fragility of privilege, and the reality that human ingenuity and confidence could be undermined by structural inequities and natural forces. It challenged assumptions about progress, technology, and social order, forcing reflection on both societal values and personal responsibility. Titanic's tragedy became a mirror, reflecting not only human ambition and achievement, but also hubris, inequality, and the ethical dimensions of action under pressure. The night of April 14, 15, 1912 remains a testament to the interplay of chaos, courage, and class. The Titanic, conceived as a symbol of human triumph, became an enduring lesson in humility, empathy, and the unpredictability of life. Survivors carried these lessons across the Atlantic into homes, communities, and history itself. Their experiences remind us that even in moments of profound disorder, human bravery can shine, and that the structures we build, social, cultural, or technological, carry consequences far beyond intention. Chaos did not destroy courage, nor did the class divide extinguish human spirit entirely. Each passenger, from the wealthiest American industrialist to the immigrant mother navigating unfamiliar corridors, participated in a shared narrative of survival, morality, and resilience. The Titanic's legacy, therefore, is not only one of tragedy, but of profound insight into the human condition. How we respond under pressure,
how we prioritize others, and how society's divisions influence the outcomes of life and death decisions. In the end, the Titanic was more than a ship, it was a crucible. Chaos tested courage, class defined opportunity, and human action illuminated both vulnerability and strength. The night revealed that survival depends not only on technology, planning, or social position, but on decisiveness, empathy, and the moral choices we make in extremity. The story of Titanic's chaos, courage, and class divide continues to resonate, teaching lessons about human nature, societal structure, and the enduring tension between hubris and humility.
The Atlantic that night was cold, dark, and silent, yet alive with the echoes of the disaster. Titanic had disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only small pockets of humanity afloat in lifeboats. These vessels, tiny compared to the massive ship they had escaped, became microcosms of survival, panic, courage, and despair. In them, the voices of those saved, American and immigrant alike, echoed across the freezing waters, telling stories that would shape the legacy of the Titanic forever. From the moment lifeboats touched the water, the air was filled with tension. Passengers huddled together, shivering from both cold and fear. Some women clutched children tightly, whispering reassurances they barely believed themselves. Others stared silently at the dark, icy sea, trying to comprehend the scale of what had just occurred. The once mighty Titanic, a floating palace and symbol of human achievement, was gone, leaving only waves and stars above. In Lifeboat 4, a group of first-class women and children struggled with panic as the boat rocked. Their rowers, crew members chosen for experience and strength, barked instructions and reassured them, but tension simmered. One young American woman, clutching her infant, whispered over and over, "We will live. We must live." Around her, passengers nodded, eyes wide, the words both a mantra and a fragile promise to themselves. Voices carried across the water, fragmented by distance and wind. Some were cries of sorrow for those lost on the ship, while others called out to nearby boats. A mother searched desperately for her husband, separated in the chaos of the sinking, while a young boy repeatedly asked if he would see New York. Each lifeboat was alive with human sound, shouts, sobs, prayers, laughter tinged with hysteria. Together, they formed an unintentional chorus of survival. In Lifeboat 6, American industrialist John Jacob Astor IV had assisted his young wife into the boat. The couple had moved quickly, trusting crew instructions, yet the tension was palpable. Astor, a man accustomed to control, now faced the vulnerability of helplessness. He sat quietly, speaking to no one, staring into the black expanse of ocean, aware that the privilege he had relied on moments before was meaningless in the face of nature. His presence provided reassurance to nearby women, though his silence spoke volumes about the human confrontation with mortality. The third-class survivors faced different challenges. In Lifeboat 12, an immigrant family huddled together, shivering and exhausted. Language barriers made communication difficult with crew, but their instincts were clear. Protect the children, stay together, survive. A father sang softly to his frightened daughter, a lullaby that had carried across generations, grounding them amidst chaos. Others whispered stories of home, of family left behind in steerage cabins, their voices tinged with fear and longing. The lifeboat became both refuge and witness to humanity under extreme stress. Crew members navigated these small boats with determination, rowing into the open ocean, away from the sinking wreck, seeking distance from debris and maintaining a semblance of order. Their voices were authoritative, calm, yet urgent. Sit down, row steady, stay together. In some cases, passengers mimicked the tone, trying to stabilize the group. The psychology of survival in these moments demanded both leadership and cooperation, and human instinct took precedence over social status. Voices also reflected moral choices and raw emotion. Some passengers whispered prayers, their faith a tether to hope. Others voiced anger at the circumstances, the arrogance of believing Titanic could not sink, the social inequities that had delayed their escape, or the absence of friends and family who were lost. In Lifeboat 10,
Two women argued over seating arrangements and space for children, a minor conflict magnified by fear, cold, and exhaustion. Each sound, each spoken word revealed the complexity of survival, self-preservation, compassion, and human imperfection, intertwined. As hours passed, the psychological strain intensified. Exposure to the freezing air and sea created both physical and mental distress. Passengers spoke less, conserving energy, but small voices, soft reassurances, whispered memories, shared laughter maintained morale. In the darkness, storytelling became a lifeline. Survivors recounted dreams of New York, childhood tales, and remembered moments of joy on the Titanic before disaster struck. These narratives, though fragmented, reminded them of life beyond the immediate danger. American voices in particular conveyed a mixture of pragmatism and emotional resilience. Men, conditioned by social expectation, often took leadership roles in maintaining lifeboat order. Women and children relied on these instructions while also providing emotional support. Survivors recall conversations that reflected values, upbringing and culture, advice for staying warm, encouragement to keep spirits high, and negotiations over shared responsibilities. The lifeboat became a classroom in crisis where courage, empathy, and cooperation were taught and tested simultaneously. The interplay of class became evident even in small boats. First-class passengers, accustomed to comfort and authority, initially struggled with the lack of structure and personal space.
Third-class passengers, having faced adversity throughout their journey, often displayed improvisation and adaptability. Observers noted that cooperation sometimes transcended social divisions. Neighbors in the lifeboat, regardless of prior status, assisted one another, shared clothing, and comforted children. Yet, underlying social habits influenced behavior subtly. Deference, expectation, and leadership often mirrored pre-existing hierarchies. Cold, hunger, and fear shaped every voice. Babies wailed, men cursed, women prayed, and sailors gave instructions over the wind. Some voices were quiet, numb with shock, while others were urgent, seeking help or guidance. A young American boy, clutching his mother's hand, repeatedly asked when they would see the ship again, not understanding it was gone forever. His innocent questions punctuated the night with piercing clarity. Life continued, even amid death and despair. The human mind, under stress, revealed both heroism and desperation. Some passengers risked exposure to freezing water to assist others in overcrowded lifeboats. Crew members threw ropes to those clinging to debris. Passengers shared coats and blankets, huddled together to conserve warmth, and exchanged whispers of reassurance. In every boat, these small acts of courage created bonds that transcended fear, class, and nationality. Survival became not only a physical challenge, but a moral and emotional one. Voices carried beyond the immediate lifeboat. The distant hum of other boats, cries across the water, and the haunting sounds from the wreck site created a soundscape of human experience under duress. Some attempted to communicate between boats, offering hope, sharing information, or asking if others had seen loved ones. In the black Atlantic night, voices became lifelines, connecting strangers and reminding them that they were not alone. As dawn approached, the first signs of relief appeared. The Carpathia's lights pierced the darkness, and the distant sound of engines reassured survivors that rescue was imminent. Conversations shifted from fear to hope. Passengers spoke of their losses, gratitude, and shock. They recounted the moments that had defined their survival, acts of kindness, bravery, and selflessness that had made the difference between life and death. The voices, once chaotic and fragmented, began to coalesce around a shared narrative. We survived, but at tremendous cost. For Americans in the lifeboats, the night became a lesson in humility, empathy, and the unpredictability of life. Industrialists, immigrants, and middle-class passengers alike confronted mortality, shared hardship, and recognized both vulnerability and strength in one another.
The voices of Titanic survivors would later shape public memory, emphasizing heroism, courage, and the lessons of human imperfection amid technological triumph and disaster. The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, had claimed Titanic, yet in these small lifeboats, humanity persisted. Every voice told a story of fear, sorrow, hope, courage, and reflection. Passengers, once separated by class and circumstance, were united by circumstance and survival. The lifeboats became crucibles of character, testing morality, resilience, and cooperation under extreme conditions. By the time the Carpathia arrived to rescue survivors, the night's terror had passed, but the psychological echoes remained. Survivors would carry the sounds, conversations, and cries of that night for the rest of their lives. Each voice was a testament to courage in the face of overwhelming odds, to the moral choices made under pressure, and to the enduring human capacity to connect, comfort, and persevere. The Titanic disaster was not merely the sinking of a ship, it was a collective human experience. Voices from the lifeboats recorded the truth of that night in ways that no official report or statistical analysis could fully capture. They revealed the complexity of emotion, the interplay of fear and bravery, the influence of social class, and the power of human connection. In the darkness of the North Atlantic, amidst freezing waters and the remnants of a lost ship, these voices endured, preserving the lessons of tragedy, courage, and shared humanity for generations to come. The survivors' stories, both American and immigrant, illustrate that catastrophe does not discriminate, yet humanity responds with both nobility and imperfection. Their voices, carrying across icy waters and into history, remind us that courage manifests not in isolation, but in the interplay of moral choice, empathy, and communal survival. Each word, whisper, cry, and laugh from that night continues to resonate, a haunting chorus that immortalizes the people who survived Titanic by their strength, by their instinct, and by their willingness to act amid chaos. And so, the lifeboats, small and fragile in comparison to the ship they had escaped, became the final vessels of human spirit. Voices from the lifeboats carried stories across generations of tragedy, resilience, heroism, and the profound realization that no luxury, no wealth, and no confidence in human mastery can replace vigilance, courage, and moral action when faced with nature's overwhelming power.
The night had ended, but the Atlantic remained unforgiving. Titanic was gone, swallowed by the icy black waves that stretched endlessly in all directions. In the wake of disaster, a silence fell over the sea, a silence that carried the weight of more than 1,500 lives lost. The small lifeboats, bobbing like fragile twigs on the vast ocean, were alive only with the breath of survivors, the whispers of the exhausted, and the occasional murmur of fear that no one dared fully voice. For those who had escaped, the cold Atlantic was both savior and reminder. Survival was a fragile gift, and death lingered everywhere in the surrounding darkness. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The water, near freezing, seeped into every layer of clothing, chilling muscles and sapping energy. Even in the lifeboats, huddled together for warmth, survivors shivered uncontrollably, their teeth rattling, their breaths misting in the cold night air. The silence, punctuated only by the gentle lapping of waves and the occasional murmur, became almost unbearable. Each survivor felt the weight of the unseen tragedy beneath them, the ship that had promised safety and grandeur, now reduced to a ghostly memory beneath the waves. American passengers, still processing the magnitude of what had occurred, clung to one another. Women whispered reassurances, children shivered against mothers' chests, and men struggled to maintain composure. The initial chaos had passed, replaced by the stark reality of solitude on the Atlantic, surrounded by nothing but the cold and the night sky. The silence was absolute in its lesson.
Human pride and ambition, however grand, were powerless against the indifferent expanse of nature. Titanic's luxury, its grandeur, its promise of invincibility, all were gone. Only the ocean remained. Survivors began to recount the moments that had brought them here. Each voice carried shock, disbelief, and grief. Stories were shared in fragmented sentences, murmured above the wind. Tales of loved ones lost, acts of courage witnessed, the haunting images of the bow plunging into the darkness, the cries that had filled the night, and the faces of friends and strangers who had vanished beneath the waves. The stories intertwined, forming a collective memory of trauma and resilience, stitched together by the shared ordeal. For many Americans, the Titanic had been a symbol of national pride and technological prowess. In these hours of isolation, they confronted the fragility of that confidence. John Jacob Astor IV, who had perished in the icy waters, became a symbol in their minds, not merely of wealth and influence, but of the illusion of security. Survivors reflected on how the ship's size and reputation had lulled them into a sense of invulnerability. The silence of the Atlantic, vast and indifferent, was a harsh teacher. Nature recognized no wealth, no status, no achievement. Yet, amidst the cold and quiet, courage persisted. Crew members and passengers alike improvised methods to conserve warmth and maintain morale. Blankets and jackets were shared, hands clasped to preserve heat, and stories told to distract children from the cold. Whispered songs, lullabies, and prayers filled the night air softly, fragments of humanity against the vast, silent expanse. In these moments, human connection, tiny, fragile, yet potent, became as essential as the physical act of staying afloat. American families, many of whom had journeyed in hope of a new life, faced both relief and profound sorrow. Parents consoled children who had witnessed unimaginable horror. Siblings comforted each other. Friends mourned those lost in the chaos of the sinking. Each breath carried both gratitude for survival and despair for the missing. The cold Atlantic, though still threatening, now became a reflective space, a liminal zone between life and the memory of death. Dawn approached, and with it came the first faint light. The blackness of the night was replaced by a gray horizon, but the silence endured. No sound came from the depths where Titanic had disappeared. No trace remained except for debris, luggage, lifeboat oars, and the occasional personal item. The survivors stared at the wreckage drifting past, understanding that the grandeur of the ship, which had symbolized confidence, pride, and achievement, had been swallowed without regard for human expectation. The silence also emphasized the human cost. Some survivors sat in stunned quiet, trying to reconcile their fortune with the absence of those around them. Others wept openly, their grief breaking the hushed stillness of the Atlantic. Americans, in particular, reflected on the inequities revealed by survival. First-class passengers had escaped at higher rates, while immigrants in steerage had suffered disproportionately. The silence of the sea became a canvas upon which the inequities of society were starkly painted. As the lifeboats awaited rescue, conversations emerged slowly, first tentative and fragmented. Survivors discussed their experiences, recounting acts of bravery, moments of indecision, and the kindness of strangers. Men who led children to safety spoke quietly to reassure themselves as much as others.
Women recounted the heroic efforts of crew members, neighbors, and even strangers. Each story, spoken softly in the cold wind, became a testimony, a living memory of resilience amid catastrophe. Yet, even in reflection, fear persisted. The Atlantic was vast and unpredictable. Icebergs remained unseen, waves could overturn lifeboats, and exhaustion threatened to overcome strength. The cold was relentless, testing the endurance of each survivor. Some recited prayers, others sang softly to ward off despair.
The silence of the ocean contrasted sharply with the human voices, emphasizing both the enormity of the loss and the fragile persistence of life. Eventually, the Carpathia appeared on the horizon, a distant light cutting through the gray dawn. Relief and anticipation mingled with exhaustion and disbelief. Crew members and passengers worked together to navigate lifeboats toward the rescue ship. Voices grew louder, not in panic, but in tentative hope. Whispers of gratitude, soft instructions and encouragement filled the air as survivors recognized that though the night had tested them to their limits, survival was within reach. Boarding the Carpathia was both a physical and emotional transition. The freezing night on the Atlantic gave way to warmth, blankets, and food. Yet the silence of the ocean and the memory of Titanic's final descent lingered in the minds of all aboard. Americans reflected on the night in hushed tones, recounting the moments that had tested courage, revealed humanity, and illuminated social inequities. Each voice was a witness, a storyteller, a custodian of collective memory. For many, the silence that followed was not only the absence of sound, but the recognition of loss. The Atlantic had taken Titanic, claiming lives, dreams, and illusions. Yet it had also revealed the strength of human spirit, the courage to act, the compassion to help strangers, and the resilience to endure in the face of despair. The voices from the lifeboats, though quiet in comparison to the chaos of the sinking, carried a deeper resonance, proof that human experience, memory, and emotion could survive where steel and hubris had failed. The cold Atlantic, still vast and dark beyond the horizon, became a symbol. It represented the limits of human control, the impartiality of nature, and the endurance of memory. Survivors, while grateful, understood that the night of April 14, 15, 1912 would never leave them. The silence of the ocean, broken only by their voices, reflected a world forever changed, where human ambition collided with nature, where society's divisions were exposed, and where courage and despair existed side by side. In the days that followed, the voices carried further. Survivors recounted their experiences to family, friends, newspapers, and official inquiries. American newspapers captured their words, often highlighting heroism, self-sacrifice, and the tragedy of class inequities. Each testimony added nuance to the collective understanding of Titanic, its grandeur, its failures, and the human stories that endured long after steel had sunk into the Atlantic depths. The cold Atlantic and the silence after became both physical and metaphorical. Survivors carried the weight of memory, the lessons of humility, and the echoes of those who did not survive. Americans who lived through the night of terror reflected on technology's limitations, human resilience, and the moral choices that define us under pressure. The silence was not emptiness, it was the space for reflection, remembrance, and the recognition of what it truly means to survive. The ocean, vast and indifferent, eventually receded from immediate threat, but the night's events remained engraved on the minds of those who floated upon it. Survivors realized that survival was not merely a matter of luck, but of courage, decision-making, and the bonds formed in moments of extreme crisis. The silence after the disaster allowed for introspection, mourning, and the beginnings of understanding the tragedy's full scope. The Titanic's legacy, as carried by the voices from the lifeboats, persisted far beyond the cold waters. Americans recounted their experiences in interviews, memoirs, and letters, capturing both the horror and the heroism. The silence of the Atlantic, once a space of threat, became a repository for memory, a witness to tragedy, and a teacher of humility. Each story preserved the human dimension of the catastrophe, the emotions, the ethical dilemmas, the courage, and the grief. Even decades later, the cold Atlantic and its haunting silence remained central to the narrative of Titanic. The disaster is remembered not only for the scale of loss, but for the profound human truths revealed in those final hours, that courage can endure amid fear,
that inequity shapes outcomes even in disaster, and that memory, carried by the voices of survivors, ensures that history teaches the lessons of humility, empathy, and respect for forces beyond human control. In the end, the survivors' voices, quivering, whispered, and resilient, became the enduring legacy of Titanic. The ship itself was gone, steel and grandeur consumed by the Atlantic, but the human stories, carried across the waves and into history, continued to speak. The silence of the ocean was filled, paradoxically, by these voices, testaments of survival, remembrance, courage, and the unbreakable human spirit.
The morning after the Titanic sank, America awoke to a new reality. Newspapers carried grim headlines across the nation, spreading disbelief and sorrow from New York to San Francisco. For a country already immersed in the belief of progress, industry, and technological invincibility, the loss of the Titanic struck like a thunderclap, a reminder that human ingenuity, no matter how celebrated, could be rendered powerless by the forces of nature. In urban centers, street corners, and offices were filled with people reading accounts of the disaster, their expressions frozen in shock. Families gathered around newspapers, realizing that acquaintances, friends, and fellow Americans had been aboard the ship. In parlors across the nation, the magnitude of the tragedy was dissected aloud. Conversations alternated between incredulity, grief, and moral questioning. How could a ship so lauded, so advanced, disappear into the icy Atlantic in a single night? For the American elite, the news carried a mixture of sorrow and self-reflection. Many had friends or business associates aboard the ship. Letters and telegrams confirmed that John Jacob Astor IV and Benjamin Guggenheim, among the wealthiest men in the nation, were lost. The realization that wealth and social position could not prevent death resonated painfully, undermining the cultural narratives of invincibility that had defined the early 20th century. The morning was filled with mourning for the lost and contemplation for the living. Immigrant communities, particularly those who had anticipated reaching New York to start new lives, felt the tragedy sharply. Friends, neighbors, and relatives had been aboard, seeking opportunity in America. The loss of hundreds of third-class passengers highlighted inequities that mirrored the class divisions aboard Titanic. While newspapers often emphasized first-class stories, families in neighborhoods like Little Italy in New York or Scandinavian communities in Boston grappled privately with grief, frustration, and fear for future journeys. Across the nation, radio and telegraph networks carried fragmented reports. Americans learned of the scale of the loss. Over 1,500 passengers and crew had perished, and the stories of survival were heroic but few. The sheer numbers defied comprehension. Citizens who had followed Titanic's construction and launch with fascination and pride now faced the enormity of human vulnerability. In offices and homes, men and women alike struggled to reconcile the narrative of progress with the reality of mortality. In New York City, the port became a focal point of public attention. Ships like the Carpathia had rescued survivors, who now arrived in the city with tales of chaos, courage, and heartbreak. Journalists interviewed passengers, capturing first-hand accounts of the icy waters, the confusion aboard the lifeboats, and the acts of heroism and despair witnessed that night. Americans listened intently, hanging on every word, as the reality of the disaster unfolded with a clarity that numbers alone could not convey. Families wrote letters frantically, seeking confirmation of loved ones' fates. Lines outside telegraph offices grew long, filled with anxious faces and trembling hands. Each message carried hope and dread, the same hope and dread that had gripped passengers aboard the lifeboats. The nation waited collectively, its heartbeat synchronized to news from across the Atlantic. In homes and offices, the disaster prompted reflection on technology, hubris, and preparedness. Editorials questioned how a ship labeled unsinkable could fail. Engineers debated design flaws and oversight failures. Religious leaders interpreted the tragedy through moral lenses, framing it as a cautionary tale about pride and human ambition. The public's response oscillated between outrage, mourning, and philosophical reflection. Titanic had become a mirror, reflecting both societal achievement and human vulnerability. American cultural consciousness was deeply affected. The ship, hailed as a triumph of modern engineering, had embodied the optimism of the Gilded Age and the confidence of industrial America. Its loss challenged that confidence, introducing doubt into the national psyche. Writers and journalists highlighted the hubris that had permeated the voyage, emphasizing both the human and technological shortcomings that contributed to disaster. In doing so, they reframed Titanic's story not merely as a maritime accident, but as a lesson for the entire nation. Government officials responded with concern and deliberation. President William Howard Taft and his advisors followed the unfolding news closely. Consular services were mobilized to communicate with survivors and families abroad. Inquiries into maritime regulations were anticipated, as Americans demanded accountability for the lives lost. The tragedy prompted early discussions about safety, emergency preparedness, and the responsibilities of private corporations engaged in transportation. The nation's institutions were forced to reckon with the consequences of human overconfidence. In communities across the United States, the tragedy ignited both collective mourning and individual contemplation. Schools paused lessons, business leaders delayed decisions, and civic organizations held meetings to discuss the disaster. Americans sought to understand what had happened and why, to reconcile personal safety with public hubris, and to find meaning in a calamity that seemed both incomprehensible and preventable. Artists, writers, and musicians began to respond as well. Paintings, poems, and stories captured the tragedy's emotional depth, portraying both the heroism of survivors and the profound sorrow of the lost. Newspapers included illustrations of lifeboats amidst the cold Atlantic, dramatizing the human struggle for life. These cultural artifacts reinforced a shared national consciousness about mortality, bravery, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. For those whose family members had perished, grief was immediate and intense. Funeral homes received news and condolences from across the country, while memorial services began to take shape even before all survivors returned. Americans confronted the emotional reality that the Titanic disaster was not a distant story, but a deeply personal one, affecting friends, neighbors, and loved ones. In this way, the tragedy moved beyond headlines and became a lived experience for countless citizens.
Social commentary emerged alongside mourning. Newspapers questioned the inequities evident in survival rates. Editorials highlighted the fact that first-class passengers were disproportionately saved, while many third-class passengers perished due to structural barriers and delayed information. Americans debated the moral and social implications, recognizing that the disaster did not occur in a vacuum, but intersected with wealth, privilege, and opportunity. Titanic, in death as in life, reflected society itself. The Carpathia survivors became symbols of endurance and witness. Interviews emphasized the human capacity for courage, sacrifice, and resilience. Americans listened to these voices, understanding that survival was not merely a product of luck, but often of action, empathy, and resourcefulness. Tales of crew members risking their lives to save others, of passengers assisting strangers, and of the quiet bravery of women and children became central narratives in shaping the public's understanding of the disaster. As days passed, the initial shock was accompanied by a growing sense of collective responsibility. Public awareness of maritime safety intensified, prompting calls for international reform. Americans discussed the need for sufficient lifeboats, reliable communication, and better training for crew members.
The tragedy catalyzed policy debates, ensuring that Titanic's lessons would not be ignored, even as grief remained raw. Religious communities offered comfort, framing the disaster within broader philosophical and moral contexts. Sermons emphasized human fragility, the unpredictability of life, and the need for compassion in the face of tragedy. Americans flocked to places of worship, seeking solace, guidance, and the opportunity to share grief communally. These gatherings reinforced national unity while underscoring the profound emotional impact of the sinking. Cultural memory began to form almost immediately. Songs, poetry, and newspaper illustrations preserved the narrative of heroism, loss, and societal reflection. Americans, captivated by the scale and emotional resonance of the disaster, engaged in public storytelling that would shape the collective consciousness. Titanic was no longer just a ship, it had become a symbol, a cautionary tale, and a canvas for understanding both human achievement and limitation. By the end of the first week, America had begun to internalize the tragedy. Survivors returned to family and friends, recounting harrowing experiences in the lifeboats. Communities mourned publicly and privately. Newspapers continued to publish detailed survivor accounts, emphasizing lessons about hubris, courage, and societal inequity. The nation's attention, initially caught by headlines and dramatic imagery, evolved into a more profound reflection on life, mortality, and the responsibilities of progress. For the American public, Titanic's sinking was not merely a maritime disaster, it was a national trauma. It exposed the limits of confidence, the consequences of technological overreach, and the moral imperatives inherent in disaster response. Citizens reflected on human vulnerability, the role of social hierarchy, and the necessity of empathy in moments of crisis. Across the country, Titanic became a touchstone for both grief and ethical reflection, shaping cultural and social discourse for years to come. The tragedy also catalyzed awareness of global interconnectedness. News of the disaster traveled rapidly, emphasizing the reach of communication networks and the shared stakes of transatlantic travel. Americans realized that maritime disasters were not distant events, but global occurrences, touching lives across continents. Titanic's sinking became both a local and international narrative, reminding the nation of its place in the wider world. In families, the disaster prompted conversations about mortality, ambition, and preparedness. Parents explained events to children, neighbors comforted one another, and communities collectively grappled with sorrow. Americans were forced to confront both the fragility of life and the power of resilience. The disaster's scale and human consequences transformed abstract concerns about progress and technology into deeply personal reflections on mortality, ethics, and societal responsibility. The memory of Titanic's sinking remained vivid for generations. Americans recalled the morning of April 15, 1912, as a day when the nation collectively realized that confidence and wealth could not shield humanity from nature's unpredictability. Newspapers, letters, memoirs, and oral accounts preserved the voices of those who survived, those who mourned, and those who reflected on the lessons of hubris and humility. The disaster became an enduring part of national consciousness, a story of both tragedy and resilience. In essence, America awoke not only to news, but to reflection. The nation mourned, questioned, and learned. Titanic's sinking revealed societal strengths and weaknesses, exposed human courage and failure, and prompted a collective reckoning with mortality and ethics. The disaster transcended its immediate context, becoming a foundational story in the cultural and historical understanding of the early 20th century. Ultimately, the tragedy united Americans in grief and reflection. From urban centers to rural communities, the story of Titanic inspired mourning, storytelling, policy discussion, and cultural expression. It underscored human vulnerability, celebrated acts of courage, and emphasized the importance of vigilance, empathy, and preparedness. Through newspapers, survivor accounts, and public discourse, Titanic became more than a ship. It became a lesson for the nation, an enduring symbol of ambition confronted by reality, and a narrative that would echo across generations.
The news of the Titanic's sinking reverberated across the United States with the force of an earthquake. By the early hours of April 15, 1912, telegrams, newspapers, and word of mouth had transformed a distant maritime disaster into a national tragedy. Americans, still asleep in their homes or rising for work, were confronted with the staggering reality. Over 1,500 lives had been lost in a single night, and among the dead were citizens from coast to coast, representing every class, age, and walk of life. The nation awoke not to the routine of spring mornings, but to a shared sense of shock and mourning that transcended geography and social status. From bustling cities to quiet rural towns, families gathered around newspapers and telegraph offices. The headlines were stark. Titanic sinks, hundreds perish in the Atlantic, or unsinkable ship meets icy fate. Street corners, cafes, and offices were filled with people reading aloud, passing copies of telegrams and speculating on the fate of loved ones. The sheer scale of the tragedy, combined with the ship's fame as a marvel of human engineering, made disbelief almost universal. Americans struggled to reconcile the vessel's reputation with the harsh reality of its loss. In urban centers like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, the media played a central role in shaping public perception. Newspapers ran special editions with illustrations, survivor interviews, and dramatic depictions of the sinking. Reporters raced to the Carpathia's docks to interview rescued passengers, capturing their testimonies in vivid detail. These narratives were often sensationalized, emphasizing heroism, chaos, and tragedy in equal measure. Yet behind the dramatization lay the raw truth. Families were grieving, communities were shocked, and the nation was collectively confronting mortality on a scale rarely experienced. Americans followed the stories of both the wealthy and the working-class passengers, discovering how social hierarchy had influenced survival. Accounts of first-class men and women who survived, alongside the tragic losses in steerage, sparked conversations about inequality and justice. Editorials questioned the procedures, the crew's decisions, and the very design of the ship. Newspapers highlighted that some lifeboats had been launched partially empty, while third-class passengers remained trapped below decks. This combination of awe, horror, and outrage created a media environment where grief intertwined with moral inquiry. In households across the nation, mourning took both public and private forms. Families who had known someone aboard Titanic lit candles, said prayers, and followed reports obsessively. Schools paused lessons, offices held moments of silence, and religious leaders addressed the disaster from pulpits. The shared mourning was national in scope, connecting Americans who had never set foot on the Atlantic Ocean, but who recognized the ship as a symbol of human ambition and modernity. The press also emphasized heroism, shaping narratives of courage and resilience. Stories of crew members who stayed behind to help passengers, of men assisting women and children into lifeboats, and of strangers supporting one another in the chaos were widely circulated. Americans absorbed these accounts, marveling at human bravery amidst unimaginable circumstances. In many cases, the media elevated individual acts of heroism to symbols of national pride, emphasizing that while tragedy was universal, courage transcended social and economic boundaries. Yet the coverage was not without controversy. Newspapers debated the responsibilities of shipbuilders, owners, and operators. How could a ship so meticulously designed fail so catastrophically? Were safety measures sufficient? Why were so many lives lost despite the availability of lifeboats? Public discourse was dominated by questions of accountability, ethics, and the relationship between progress and hubris. Americans grappled with these questions, recognizing that the disaster was not only a maritime tragedy, but a reflection of societal priorities, technological overconfidence, and human fallibility. For immigrant communities, particularly those traveling in third class, the coverage was bittersweet. Many survivors returned to families who had been waiting anxiously for news. The media often underrepresented these passengers, focusing on first-class stories. Yet the human dimension, the grief, fear, and resilience of those affected could not be ignored. Community leaders organized support networks, sought information, and tried to comfort families who had lost loved ones. The disaster highlighted inequities that existed both aboard Titanic and within society at large, emphasizing the social realities Americans could no longer overlook. American culture, shaped by both optimism and industrial pride, struggled to absorb the psychological impact. For a generation raised to believe in human ingenuity, Titanic's sinking represented a stark lesson in humility. Newspapers, magazines, and journals explored this theme relentlessly. Editorials analyzed the limitations of modern engineering, the hubris of unchecked ambition, and the consequences of overconfidence. The disaster became a symbol of the delicate balance between technological achievement and human oversight, teaching the nation that even the grandest creations were vulnerable to nature's unpredictability. Telegraph networks amplified the immediacy of news, connecting families, reporters, and officials in a web of information that spread rapidly across the continent. The speed with which Americans received updates added to the collective shock. Daily life was interrupted as people paused to read the latest reports, confirm names of survivors or victims, and follow the Carpathia's journey back to New York. For many, the morning of April 15, 1912, was a day of suspended disbelief, a day when the ordinary rhythms of life were replaced by grief and reflection. Religious leaders interpreted the disaster as a moral and spiritual lesson. Sermons framed the sinking as a cautionary tale about pride and human limitation, emphasizing the need for humility, compassion, and moral responsibility. Churches became centers of mourning and reflection, where Americans could process grief collectively. In these sacred spaces, the shock of the event was tempered by a search for meaning, a desire to understand the tragedy within a broader moral framework. American artists, writers, and musicians responded quickly, documenting the disaster through visual and literary means. Newspaper illustrations depicted lifeboats adrift on the freezing Atlantic, survivors struggling for warmth, and families praying for the lost. Poets and essayists captured the emotional and philosophical dimensions of the tragedy, exploring themes of courage, mortality, and societal inequity. These cultural artifacts preserved the collective shock, ensuring that the event would remain a reference point for generations to come.
The impact on policy and regulation was immediate, though not yet codified. Public debate emerged over the need for lifeboat requirements, emergency protocols, and maritime safety inspections. The American public, confronted with the stark human consequences, began to demand accountability. Letters to editors, public meetings, and civic discussions reflected a growing awareness that Titanic's loss was not merely an isolated incident, but a systemic failure with lessons for society as a whole. Mourning was both public and deeply personal. Survivors recounted their experiences in newspapers, letters, and interviews. Families grieved their lost loved ones, neighbors supported one another, and communities held vigils to honor the dead. Americans collectively absorbed the tragedy, participating in a national process of mourning that transcended individual loss. The shared grief created a sense of unity, a recognition that the disaster affected not only those aboard Titanic, but the nation as a whole. In addition to grief, the American public experienced profound shock. The scale of loss, the vivid survivor testimonies, and the technological failure challenged assumptions about safety, progress, and social order. The disaster became a point of reflection for both citizens and leaders, prompting consideration of ethical, moral, and practical implications. Titanic was no longer simply a ship, it was a lesson, a cautionary tale, and a mirror reflecting human ambition, societal divisions, and vulnerability. Families who lost loved ones struggled with both absence and uncertainty. For weeks, they sought confirmation of deaths or survival, often relying on telegrams or newspaper accounts. The emotional toll was immense, as grief mingled with the frustration of delayed information. Public memorials began to take shape even before all survivors returned, emphasizing the nation's collective recognition of the magnitude of loss. The American press played a central role in shaping memory. Editors and journalists framed the narrative, highlighting heroism, human error, and societal reflection. The coverage, though sometimes sensationalized, ensured that the tragedy entered the national consciousness in both emotional and analytical forms. Americans, from students to industrialists, absorbed these stories, internalizing lessons about mortality, courage, and societal responsibility. The shock of the disaster was compounded by the realization that Titanic's sinking was avoidable. Investigations revealed that ice warnings had been ignored, lifeboat drills were insufficient, and safety protocols were flawed. The public debated the ethical dimensions of these failures, holding shipowners, captains, and crew accountable. Americans, already attuned to ideas of progress and human ingenuity, confronted a sobering reality. Ambition without caution can have catastrophic consequences. Cultural expressions flourished as the nation sought to process grief. Songs, poems, and essays circulated widely, reflecting the collective mourning. Artists painted scenes of lifeboats adrift, survivors huddled in the cold, and the vanished grandeur of the ship. These works ensured that Titanic's story would endure not only in memory, but also in artistic and cultural consciousness. Americans absorbed these narratives, learning to balance admiration for human achievement with respect for nature's power. The collective mourning and shock reinforced a sense of national empathy. Americans connected emotionally with both survivors and the deceased, understanding that tragedy spared no one based on class or nationality. The disaster prompted reflection on social responsibility, equity, and compassion. Editorials, letters, and public discussions emphasized that human action, ethics, and foresight are as important as technical expertise in preventing or mitigating disaster. Over time, memorial services, public tributes, and commemorative events became central to the national response. Communities honored local residents who had been aboard, while national ceremonies emphasized both mourning and the lessons learned. Americans reflected on the disaster's moral and practical implications, recognizing that Titanic's legacy extended beyond maritime history into national consciousness, public policy, and cultural memory. The stories of heroism and survival, widely disseminated in the press, inspired Americans to think critically about courage, selflessness, and ethical behavior. Passengers who assisted strangers, risked their lives for family, or demonstrated leadership in crisis became exemplars of human character. These narratives, widely reported, shaped public understanding of both human vulnerability and human potential. The shock of the disaster also prompted Americans to consider the future. Discussions emerged about engineering standards, maritime law, and safety regulations. Families and communities questioned how such a tragedy could be prevented and what responsibilities individuals and institutions had toward collective safety. Titanic became a catalyst for both mourning and reform, demonstrating that national grief can inspire reflection, accountability, and change. In conclusion, the morning after the Titanic sank, America experienced a complex mix of mourning, media frenzy, and national shock. The disaster exposed the limits of technology, the vulnerability of humanity, and the inequalities embedded in society. Newspapers, telegraphs, and word of mouth amplified grief, while survivor accounts and editorial commentary guided reflection and understanding. Americans absorbed the lessons of courage, failure, and societal responsibility, ensuring that Titanic's story would resonate long after the waves had claimed the ship. Through collective mourning and media coverage, the nation not only honored the dead, but also began to process the ethical, practical, and emotional lessons of the tragedy. Titanic became more than a ship. It became a symbol of human ambition, fallibility, and resilience. Mourning, media, and national shock together shaped the American memory of the disaster, ensuring that the echoes of that cold Atlantic night would endure for generations.
The Titanic disaster did not simply end when the last lifeboat was pulled aboard the Carpathia. Across the Atlantic, questions multiplied. How could a ship celebrated as the pinnacle of modern engineering sink without warning, claiming more than 1,500 lives? Americans, shocked and grieving, demanded answers. The tragedy had become both a national and international crisis, prompting inquiries, investigations, and heated debates about human error, technological overconfidence, and moral responsibility. In Washington, New York, and London, committees were formed almost immediately. Congressional representatives, maritime officials, and engineers convened hearings to dissect the disaster. In the United States, Senator William Alden Smith led the Senate inquiry, tasked with understanding the causes and preventing a similar catastrophe. His hearings opened a window into the technical, social, and human failures that had led to Titanic's demise, placing Americans in the role of witnesses to both tragedy and accountability. The Senate inquiry brought together survivors, crew members, and experts in maritime engineering. Passengers recounted their experiences with vivid detail: the confusion as the ship struck the iceberg, the chaos in the corridors, and the desperate efforts to secure a place in the lifeboats. Crew members provided testimony on the actions taken or not taken to navigate ice warnings and manage the evacuation. The hearings revealed that warnings had been sent by multiple ships in the area, but were either ignored or misunderstood, underscoring lapses in judgment and communication. The inquiry also revealed alarming deficiencies in preparedness. Titanic, despite being the largest and most luxurious ship of its time, carried lifeboats for only a fraction of its passengers. Many lifeboats were launched partially empty due to confusion, lack of training, and overconfidence in the vessel's supposed unsinkability. Americans listening to or reading these accounts were confronted with a sobering truth. Privilege, technology, and wealth were insufficient safeguards against disaster. Heroism could save some, but structural failures endangered all. Testimonies highlighted the human element of blame. Captain Edward Smith faced scrutiny for his decisions, including maintaining speed through icy waters and delayed responses to iceberg warnings. Officers and crew were questioned for their handling of the evacuation, revealing both acts of courage and moments of hesitation. Survivors described individuals who had risked their lives to help others, while also recounting those who acted out of panic or self-interest. The hearings brought the complexity of human behavior into sharp relief, reminding Americans that morality and judgment are tested most acutely in moments of crisis. The press played a central role in framing public understanding. Newspapers published detailed summaries of the inquiries, complete with illustrations and diagrams of the ship and its lifeboat deployment. Americans were captivated by the revelations, dissecting every technical flaw and human misstep. Headlines alternated between outrage, fascination, and moral reflection. Captain and crew under fire.
unsinkable ships' hubris exposed, and lessons learned for the safety of all seafarers. The media made the hearings not only informative but also emotionally compelling, bridging technical analysis and human drama. Engineers and maritime experts testified about design flaws that had contributed to the catastrophe. Titanic's watertight compartments, while advanced, were insufficient to prevent sinking once several were breached. Materials used in the ship's hull's construction, the placement of bulkheads, and the design of lifeboat davits were all examined meticulously. Americans learned that even technological marvels are subject to limitations, and that progress must be tempered by rigorous testing, foresight, and ethical responsibility. The hearings also explored communication failures. Wireless operators on Titanic had transmitted iceberg warnings, yet these messages were delayed or not prioritized. The inquiry revealed systemic flaws in maritime communication, prompting Americans to recognize that technology alone cannot guarantee safety. Human decision-making and accountability remain essential. Lessons learned from these failures would shape regulatory practices for decades. Class distinctions emerged as another point of scrutiny. Testimonies illustrated that first-class passengers had disproportionately survived, while many third-class and immigrant passengers had been trapped below decks. Americans were confronted with the harsh realities of social hierarchy in disaster situations. Public outrage prompted discussions about fairness, equity, and the moral obligations of those responsible for safety, highlighting that societal structures can exacerbate natural and technological dangers. The hearings were emotionally charged. Survivors recounted moments of desperation, loss, and courage in testimony that gripped the nation. Their voices humanized the abstract statistics of casualties, transforming numbers into stories of mothers, children, friends, and strangers. Americans, reading or listening to these accounts, were reminded of the personal dimensions of tragedy, the humanity behind every life lost and every life saved. American lawmakers began to focus on legislative reforms. The inquiry's findings prompted immediate proposals to improve maritime safety. Recommendations included increasing lifeboat capacity, implementing mandatory lifeboat drills, requiring continuous wireless communication, and enforcing stricter ice patrols in the North Atlantic. These measures were designed not only to prevent recurrence, but also to restore public confidence in transatlantic travel. Citizens understood that the Titanic disaster had revealed both vulnerabilities and opportunities for reform, reinforcing the nation's commitment to safety and oversight. In addition to technical reforms, ethical questions were debated extensively. Americans considered the responsibilities of ship owners, captains, and crew. How should society balance profit, ambition, and human life? What obligations did wealthy companies have to passengers of all classes? Editorials, lectures, and public discussions emphasized that accountability must extend beyond immediate actions to encompass planning, design, and social equity.
The Titanic hearings became a moral as well as legal examination, forcing Americans to grapple with questions that transcended the disaster itself. Media coverage amplified these debates. Newspapers published excerpts from hearings, diagrams of lifeboat deployment, and analyses of Captain Smith's decisions. Journalists framed the story in ways that emphasized both technical failure and human drama. Americans, following the coverage, engaged in vigorous discussions in parlors, workplaces, and public spaces. Titanic became not merely a ship, but a narrative lens through which the nation examined human ambition, ethical responsibility, and societal priorities. Investigations revealed that the maritime industry as a whole needed reform. Lifeboat regulations, ship construction standards, emergency preparedness, and crew training were all identified as critical areas for improvement. Americans, shocked by the preventable aspects of the disaster, demanded changes that would protect all passengers, regardless of class or wealth. These reforms would later culminate in international agreements and the establishment of safety protocols that still influence maritime policy today. For survivors, the hearings were both painful and cathartic. Many testified reluctantly, reliving the horror of that night, while others took solace in contributing to a process aimed at preventing future tragedy. Their stories emphasized human resilience, ethical courage, and the need for systemic safeguards. Americans absorbed these narratives with a mix of admiration, grief, and determination to learn from the disaster. Public reactions varied. Some Americans were outraged at the failures revealed, while others marveled at the bravery and ingenuity displayed by crew and passengers. Discussions of Titanic permeated classrooms, workplaces, and social clubs. Citizens debated not only technical issues, but also the moral lessons, vigilance, preparedness, compassion, and social responsibility. The disaster became a national dialogue, linking grief with inquiry, outrage with reform, and tragedy with enduring lessons. Investigators also emphasized the need for international cooperation. Shipping was a global enterprise, and Titanic's disaster revealed gaps in communication, safety standards, and enforcement that transcended national boundaries. Americans recognized that preventing future catastrophes required both domestic reforms and collaboration with other nations. The hearings thus fostered a sense of shared responsibility, reinforcing the idea that safety and accountability are universal imperatives. In the months following the disaster, legislative bodies implemented sweeping changes. The United States passed new maritime laws requiring sufficient lifeboats for all passengers, continuous wireless communication, and rigorous safety drills. International conventions addressed ice patrols, ship design standards, and crew training requirements. Titanic had become a catalyst, transforming grief and outrage into tangible action that would protect countless lives in the future. The process of investigation, blame, and reform extended far beyond Titanic itself. Americans recognized that disaster could strike even in moments of human triumph, and that rigorous oversight, ethical responsibility, and preparedness were essential. The inquiry illuminated systemic flaws, celebrated acts of courage, and fostered a culture of accountability that reshaped maritime travel, corporate responsibility, and public consciousness. Titanic's story, once told only in horror and awe, now included lessons of justice, regulation, and ethical reflection. Americans engaged with the hearings not only to understand the technical causes, but to absorb moral and societal implications. Each testimony, diagram, and report contributed to a collective understanding. Progress without prudence, wealth without accountability, and ambition without empathy can have catastrophic consequences. In the end, the investigations revealed both human error and institutional failure, but also human courage and potential for reform. Americans internalized these lessons, transforming grief into vigilance, shock into policy, and tragedy into enduring guidance for generations to come. Titanic became a symbol not only of hubris and loss, but also of learning, resilience, and the enduring capacity of a society to reflect, reform, and honor the lives forever altered by a single night on the North Atlantic.
Even long after the Titanic sank beneath the icy waves of the North Atlantic, its memory continued to ripple across the United States. The disaster of April 14–15, 1912 had left an indelible mark on the national consciousness, shaping how Americans understood human ambition, social inequity, courage, and technological progress. As survivors returned home, newspapers printed their stories and congressional hearings disseminated the lessons learned. The Titanic became far more than a shipwreck. It became a mirror reflecting both the best and worst of humanity. For Americans in the weeks following the disaster, Titanic became a lens through which to examine society itself. Families mourned lost loved ones while marveling at the courage displayed by strangers, crew, and fellow passengers. In homes across the country, discussions shifted from disbelief to reflection as citizens pondered the broader implications of the tragedy. The sinking was not just a maritime incident, it was a national event that forced Americans to confront issues of class, morality, and the consequences of hubris. Media coverage played a central role in cementing Titanic's legacy. Newspapers printed survivor interviews, diagrams of the ship's sinking, and evocative illustrations of lifeboats adrift in the cold Atlantic. Americans across social classes consumed these accounts with a mixture of horror, admiration, and introspection. The dramatic retellings highlighted human heroism while simultaneously exposing failures in judgment, design, and social systems. Editorials urged readers to consider not only the disaster's immediate causes, but also its broader ethical and societal ramifications. Public memorials became sites of national mourning and reflection. Across cities, towns, and neighborhoods, Americans held vigils, ceremonies, and services to honor the dead. Churches integrated prayers for the Titanic's victims into regular worship, while civic organizations created commemorative events that emphasized collective grief and solidarity. These memorials did more than mourn the deceased. They embedded Titanic in American memory as a symbol of both loss and the enduring need for vigilance and compassion. American writers and artists contributed to the preservation of Titanic's story. Journalists, essayists, and novelists explored the emotional, moral, and social dimensions of the disaster. Poets captured the haunting silence of the Atlantic, the bravery of those in lifeboats, and the enduring sorrow of families left behind. Illustrators depicted the ship in its final moments, the chaos of the deck, and the drifting lifeboats. Through these works, Titanic became a cultural artifact, an event whose resonance extended far beyond immediate grief into literature, visual arts, and collective imagination. The disaster also became a tool for examining social inequities. Americans recognized that survival had often depended on wealth and privilege, with first-class passengers disproportionately saved, while many third-class and immigrant passengers perished. This inequity prompted national discussions about fairness, social responsibility, and the moral obligations of those in positions of power. Editorials and public debates questioned not only maritime practices but also societal hierarchies, urging Americans to consider how structural inequalities shape human outcomes in crisis. Titanic's legacy in American memory was further reinforced by the stories of heroism that emerged from the disaster. Crew members and passengers alike had performed extraordinary acts of bravery, from guiding children into lifeboats to remaining aboard the sinking ship to assist others. These narratives became central to the American understanding of the disaster, emphasizing the capacity for courage and selflessness even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Americans admired these acts not only as examples of individual virtue, but also as reflections of national character and resilience. The inquiry and reform processes that followed Titanic's sinking also shaped memory. Congressional hearings, survivor testimonies, and international investigations exposed failures in design, communication, and emergency preparedness. Americans followed these proceedings closely, gaining insight into the technical, human, and ethical dimensions of the disaster. The resulting reforms, including stricter lifeboat requirements, wireless communication protocols, and ice patrols, were celebrated as tangible outcomes of tragedy, reinforcing the idea that the nation could learn from its mistakes and honor the memory of the dead through action. Titanic's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris and overconfidence.
Americans remembered how the ship had been advertised as unsinkable, and how that belief contributed to fatal misjudgments. The narrative of technological pride undone by nature served as a moral and cultural lesson, teaching that innovation must be tempered with humility, foresight, and ethical responsibility. Titanic's memory encouraged a generation of Americans to balance ambition with caution, confidence with prudence, and technological optimism with respect for nature's limits. For immigrant communities and working-class Americans, Titanic's memory carried a dual message. On one hand, the disaster highlighted vulnerabilities and inequities, exposing the consequences of social hierarchy in life and death situations. On the other hand, survivor stories and media coverage validated their experiences, ensuring that the tragedy was not solely defined by the elite. These communities preserved Titanic in memory as a shared human experience, one that acknowledged both loss and resilience, inequity and courage. American schools and educators incorporated Titanic into broader lessons about science, ethics, and social responsibility. Students learned about the ship's construction, the physics of its sinking, and the consequences of ignoring safety protocols. Beyond technical knowledge, the story was used to instill values, the importance of preparation, empathy, leadership in crisis, and moral decision-making. Titanic thus became both a historical event and an ethical case study, embedding its lessons into the minds of future generations. Public fascination with Titanic extended into storytelling and popular culture. Lectures, magazine articles, and early films recounted the disaster in vivid detail, dramatizing heroism and tragedy alike. Americans engaged with these narratives eagerly, drawn to the human drama while reflecting on broader societal lessons. Titanic's sinking became a lens through which the nation examined itself, its values, priorities, and aspirations. The story endured because it spoke simultaneously to the human capacity for greatness and the dangers of human error.
Commemoration of Titanic's victims became a national ritual. Monuments, plaques, and memorial services reminded Americans of the lives lost, while also symbolizing the lessons derived from the disaster. Families of survivors and victims contributed to collective memory through memoirs, letters, and oral histories. These personal accounts preserved not only the factual events, but also the emotions, fears, and reflections that accompanied survival and loss. In doing so, Titanic's memory became both public and deeply personal, anchored in collective consciousness. Titanic also influenced national discussions about morality, ethics, and the responsibilities of corporations. The disaster exposed failures in oversight, planning, and prioritization of profit over safety. Americans debated the obligations of companies toward human life, considering how regulatory frameworks, ethical standards, and societal accountability intersected. Titanic's memory reinforced the idea that human ambition and technological achievement must be balanced by ethical responsibility and foresight. The lessons of courage and human resilience resonated across generations. Americans remembered acts of heroism not as isolated incidents, but as examples of character under pressure. Crew members and passengers who risked or sacrificed their lives became symbols of moral fortitude, and their stories were retold to illustrate ethical principles in action. In this way, Titanic's legacy transcended history, serving as both inspiration and guidance for how individuals and communities respond in crisis. Titanic's impact on American culture extended to maritime policy and international relations. Americans became more aware of the importance of global cooperation in safety standards, ice patrols, and communication protocols. The disaster underscored that tragedies of this scale cannot be confined by national borders. They require shared responsibility, transparency, and vigilance. Titanic thus became a touchstone for discussions about international law, humanitarian concern, and the global implications of technological and human failure. Over time, the memory of Titanic evolved into a broader meditation on ambition, mortality, and legacy. Americans reflected on the lives lost, the hubris of human pride, and the courage of those who survived. The ship's sinking became a symbol of the fragility of human achievement, reminding citizens that no matter how advanced society becomes, nature's power and the unpredictability of fate remain constants. Titanic encouraged Americans to temper confidence with caution, pride with humility, and ambition with ethical consideration. Art, literature, and storytelling ensured that Titanic's legacy endured. Books, essays, plays, and illustrations recounted the disaster with nuance, emphasizing both human heroism and institutional failure. These narratives preserved memory across decades, allowing Americans to engage with the tragedy long after the Atlantic waves had claimed the ship. Through these cultural expressions, Titanic remained alive in the national imagination, a story of human ambition, ethical responsibility, and the enduring consequences of tragedy. American education, public discourse, and memorialization combined to enshrine Titanic in national consciousness. Lessons about engineering, social responsibility, courage, and ethics were drawn from the disaster and integrated into civic awareness. The story of Titanic became a reference point for understanding human behavior, societal structures, and moral choices under extreme conditions. Its legacy was not only historical but pedagogical, shaping the values and reflections of generations of Americans. The disaster also prompted Americans to reflect on societal inequities more broadly. The differential survival rates of passengers underscored the consequences of class, privilege, and access. Discussions in newspapers, civic organizations, and homes emphasized fairness, empathy, and societal obligation. Titanic's memory became intertwined with national conversations about justice, responsibility, and the ethical imperatives of social structures. Through survivor stories, media coverage, memorials, and cultural expression, Titanic became a permanent fixture in American memory. Its legacy included lessons about technology, morality, leadership, social responsibility, and resilience. The ship's grandeur, hubris, tragedy, and heroism were woven into narratives that educated, inspired, and cautioned the nation. Americans recognized that the disaster's lessons extended far beyond the ocean. They applied to every aspect of life, from industrial ambition to personal ethics. Ultimately, Titanic's lasting legacy in American memory was complex and multifaceted. It was a story of human achievement and fallibility, of social inequity and moral courage, of grief and reflection. Americans preserved the disaster not only as historical fact, but as a moral and cultural touchstone, ensuring that the tragedy would continue to inform, inspire, and caution generations long after the waves had swallowed the ship. The Titanic became a symbol of the delicate balance between ambition and humility, progress and prudence, reminding the nation that memory itself is a vessel for lessons that transcend time, tragedy, and circumstance. Even today, the echoes of that April night endure in American consciousness. Through memorials, literature, education, and collective remembrance, Titanic remains a powerful narrative about human endeavor, ethical responsibility, and societal reflection. It is a story that continues to teach, inspire, and humble, proving that some legacies are carved not in stone, but in the hearts and minds of those who remember.